Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, hidden beneath the landscapes of America lies a mystery carved in stone. A forgotten monument that has challenged the way we understand the ancient past. For generations, these massive stone structures have stood silently, weathering centuries of change while holding clues about the people who created them. Their size, design, and purpose have inspired countless questions from historians, archaeologists, and curious explorers. Who built this incredible megalith? How did ancient people move and shape such enormous stones without modern technology? And what can this forgotten monument reveal about the civilizations that lived across America thousands of years ago? As researchers continue to study ancient sites and uncover new evidence, these mysterious stones are helping us piece together a deeper story of human creativity, innovation, and survival. Before starting the story, like and subscribe to my channel for more stories. Now, start the story. Tonight, we journey into the hidden world of America's ancient megaliths, a place where stone, history, and mystery come together. So dim the lights, relax, and join us as we uncover the secrets of a forgotten monument that may change the way we look at America's ancient past. There exists a particular corner of America that remains unknown to the vast majority of its citizens. This obscurity does not stem from irrelevance or triviality, but rather from the profound discomfort it stirs within the halls of power and established knowledge. It speaks of a past for this continent that challenges the narratives carefully constructed by influential institutions. This place rests quietly within the terrain, partially swallowed by the earth. Its surface is worn smooth by endless winds, its existence predating anything the conventional history books claim should be present upon this soil. Those who have dedicated their lives to its study, who have navigated its shadowy corridors, meticulously mapped its alignments, and subjected its stones to the full scrutiny of modern scientific instrumentation, often confess in hushed, measured tones, with the careful composure of individuals acutely aware of the professional perils of unconventional pronouncements, that their findings simply refuse to align with the prevailing model of American antiquity. This evening, we intend to pursue that elusive thread, moving deliberately through the shadows. We will explore the testimony of the stones themselves, the revelations of rigorous science, and the profound implications of the ensuing quiet. If your intention in listening is to drift towards slumber, then you have arrived at precisely the right place. Perhaps you might consider joining this journey and share in the comments where you find yourself at this moment, and what the hour happens to be. Prior to our immersion in the specifics of the stone structures, it is essential to establish the context of the ground upon which they rest. The established chronicle of American prehistory, the sanctioned version presented in educational texts, featured in documentaries, and professed in academic halls across the nation, commences with a singular, definitive event. According to this account, between 15,000 and 12,000 years in the past, small, nomadic groups of hunters traversed a terrestrial bridge connecting the lands of Siberia and Alaska. This pathway, known as Beringia, was exposed because the last great ice age had sequestered such vast quantities of the planet's water within immense glaciers that sea levels plummeted, revealing a wide, traversable corridor between the two great continents. These hunters, driven by their pursuit of the colossal megafauna upon which they depended, mammoths, giant bison, wild horses, and camels, ventured eastward, then south. They populated a pristine, untouched wilderness, establishing themselves as the premier human inhabitants of the Americas. All that preceded them is a void. All that followed constitutes the bedrock of what we now recognize as Native American civilization. This framework is designated the Clovis First Hypothesis, named for the New Mexican town near which, during the 1930s, archaeologists unearthed distinctive stone spear points interred with the remains of extinct Pleistocene creatures. Those projectile points, subsequently discovered at numerous locations across North America, became the foundational artifacts of American prehistory. They served as our genesis, our dawn, our foundational moment. Their creators were deemed our first Americans. For many years, this model prevailed with the tenacious resistance characteristic of theories that have evolved beyond mere academic postulation into institutional identity. Generations of scholars constructed their professional lives upon this premise. Museum exhibitions were organized around its principles. The narrative of primacy, chronology, and origin became almost inviolable. However, fissures began to appear in this monolithic structure. These fractures, in truth, started manifesting decades prior to any widespread recognition. Researchers consistently unearthed objects in locations where they had no theoretical right to exist, at depths that suggested ages the model vehemently denied. Stone implements were discovered in Texas, buried beneath sediment layers whose formation would have required considerably more than 12 millennia. Butchered animal bones were found in Florida, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, yielding dates that pressed uncomfortably towards 30,000 years ago and beyond. What appeared to be ancient hearths, evidence of fire utilization, were located in Brazilian rock shelters, positioned so deep within the sedimentary column that the only intellectually honest chronology assigned them an age somewhere beyond 40,000 years. On each occasion, the established order responded with predictable uniformity. The dating methodologies were flawed. The contextual associations were contaminated. The researchers had committed errors. The accepted model could not be invalidated simply because it constituted the accepted model, leaving no conceptual space for anything more ancient. Yet the stones continued their silent testimony. In a specific region of New England, amidst the gently rolling hills and dense woodlands of an area commonly associated with colonial history, vibrant autumn colors, and a timeline extending no further back than the Puritan settlers, the stones were conveying a message that no official authority was prepared to acknowledge. There exists a location in Vermont familiar to the indigenous population for an immense period. When European colonists arrived during the 17th century, they discovered it already present, evidently ancient, and displaying a structural organization that did not correspond to anything produced by natural forces alone. These were chambers, stone chambers constructed into hillsides, their roofs formed by massive, flat slabs, each weighing several tons. Their interiors exhibited careful shaping, and their entrances were oriented in directions that appeared deliberate, calculated, and designed with an awareness of solar movements. The colonists labeled them root cellars. They categorized them as colonial-era storage facilities. They relegated them to the convenient and familiar classification of the ordinary and continued their daily lives. However, those who possessed genuine expertise in root cellars consistently noted that such structures do not resemble these edifices. Root cellars are rectangular. They are excavated according to the techniques and conventions of European agricultural practices. They feature wooden doors and ventilation systems appropriate for preserving vegetables. They do not possess astronomically aligned entryways. They lack core-belled ceilings constructed from stones that could only have been moved with immense labor and ingenuity. They do not contain interior niches positioned at heights and orientations that suggest purposes far removed from the simple storage of root vegetables. Nevertheless, the root cellar explanation persisted, because the alternative, the implication of what the structures genuinely appeared to represent, was too unsettling for acceptance. Let us contemplate the true nature of these constructions. Distributed across New England, primarily within Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York, there are approximately 105 documented stone chamber sites. Some approximations suggest a higher number, potentially several hundred, if smaller structures and collapsed examples are included. They are constructed from locally sourced stone, predominantly granite and schist, heavy metamorphic and igneous rocks that do not lend themselves to easy manipulation. They employ no mortar. They are fitted stone against stone utilizing a technique known as dry stone construction, a method demanding considerable skill and substantial time investment. The chambers range in size from modest alcoves, barely spacious enough for a person to crawl into, to full interior areas where one can stand upright, where the ceiling arches overhead in a corbelled vault, distributing the weight of the soil above across the stones in a manner that has ensured their stability for an indeterminate yet considerable period. The most renowned among these is the site in Salem, New Hampshire, dubbed America's Stonehenge, although that name, with its commercial implications, perhaps misrepresents the site's true essence. The Salem location encompasses approximately 30 acres. It comprises a central courtyard surrounded by a series of chambers and walls. It features a stone platform that some researchers have identified as an altar, a broad, flat stone incised with grooves that could have channeled liquids. It has standing stones arranged around the site's perimeter, positioned in alignment with significant solar and lunar occurrences. The summer solstice sunrise, the winter solstice sunset, the equinox positions, and the lunar extremes. These alignments are not approximate. They are precise to within fractions of a degree. This precision indicates either an extraordinary and unprecedented sequence of coincidences in American archaeological history, or deliberate, calculated design. Radiocarbon analysis at the site has produced dates ranging from the early centuries of the Common Era to several millennia before the present. Some dates are genuinely extraordinary, extending back 4,000 years before the current era, placing the construction of these structures in the same general period as the European Bronze Age and the Old Kingdom of Egypt. No civilization recognized within the accepted chronicle of North American prehistory could have achieved this construction at that time. This is where the narrative becomes particularly compelling. Allow me to guide your thoughts across the Atlantic, for understanding what may be unfolding in New England necessitates a comprehension of what was transpiring on the opposite shore. Between roughly 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, the peoples of Atlantic Europe were engaged in a remarkable endeavor. They were constructing on a monumental scale using stone. They erected standing stones, stone circles, passage tombs, and dolmens across a vast expanse, stretching from Portugal in the south to Scotland in the north, from Ireland in the west to Denmark in the east. Thousands of these edifices survive today. Tens of thousands likely existed before the ravages of time, agriculture, and development claimed them. These monuments share certain common characteristics. They are oriented towards astronomical events. They employ substantial, carefully selected stones. They are constructed without mortar. They are associated with burial practices and rituals suggesting a sophisticated understanding of temporal cycles and the movements of celestial bodies. They represent an enormous investment of communal labor sustained over many generations. Archaeologists classify the people who built them as megalithic cultures, derived from the Greek term for large stone. They were not a monolithic people with a single language or social structure. They constituted a diffuse network of interconnected cultures, sharing particular practices, beliefs, and technical traditions across a vast geographical area over a prolonged period. The question that hangs over the New England stone chambers, like a persistent, cold New England fog, is this: is it conceivable that individuals from these Atlantic megalithic traditions reached North America? The conventional response is an unequivocal negative. The conventional response has always been an emphatic denial. The ocean is deemed too vast, the technology too rudimentary, the evidence too insubstantial. However, the conventional response has been proven erroneous previously. In 1960, A team of Scandinavian archaeologists excavating a site in Newfoundland, designated Lance aux Meadows, unearthed the remnants of a Norse settlement. This settlement was dated to approximately 1,000 years ago. It contained iron smelting facilities, a distinctive Norse architectural style, and artifacts that could only have originated in Scandinavia. The Norse had reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. The entire academic establishment had declared this impossible. Yet the folklore had always maintained it happened. The folklore proved to be accurate. And the Norse, despite their maritime prowess, were not the first people to traverse open water. The Polynesian peoples colonized virtually the entirety of the Pacific Ocean in seafaring canoes. They reached Hawaii. They reached Easter Island. They reached New Zealand. The distances they covered across thousands of miles of open ocean, with no modern instrumentation, no maps, no GPS, no radio, represent maritime feats that render the Atlantic crossing appear comparatively modest. The Atlantic, in reality, may be a more navigable ocean than it first appears, particularly in its northern latitudes. There exists a route, well documented through modern experimental voyages and ancient traditions, that hugs the coasts and island chains of the North Atlantic. This route extends from Iberia to the Canary Islands, then to the Azores, or alternatively along the coasts of France, England, and Scotland, across to Iceland and Greenland, and onwards to North America. Both routes were traveled by pre-modern peoples. Both routes harness prevailing winds and ocean currents in ways that render the crossings, while arduous and perilous, genuinely achievable with the technology available during the Bronze Age. A researcher named Barry Fell, a Harvard marine biologist who cultivated a later-in-life fascination with ancient inscriptions, devoted decades to arguing that the New England stone chambers were constructed by ancient Celts, specifically by a people he associated with the Celts of Iberia, whom he termed Iberian Celts. He documented what he believed were inscriptions at various New England sites in a script called Ogham, an ancient Irish writing system employing a series of lines cut along a central stem. He identified inscriptions that he interpreted as dedicatory texts to Celtic deities. Fell's work was contentious. It remains contentious. Academic archaeologists pointed out, with some justification, that Fell displayed a propensity for perceiving patterns in natural rock formations that other experts could not substantiate, and that his linguistic interpretations were not accepted by specialists in ancient languages. The academic community largely dismissed his conclusions, and not without valid reasoning. However, here is the salient point about Barry Fell. He may have been incorrect in some specific details, but he may have been fundamentally correct in his general direction, because the Ogham inscriptions are not the sole anomaly in this narrative. In 1975, a retired schoolteacher named Gloria Farley was walking through a forest in Vermont when she observed something unusual about a particular hillside. The manner in which the trees grew around a certain rocky outcropping suggested that the underlying ground had been disturbed, not recently, but in the distant past. She began excavating carefully with hand tools, adhering to the protocol of an amateur, yet possessing the instincts of someone who had spent years attuned to the landscape. Over several seasons of meticulous excavation, she uncovered a stone structure buried beneath several feet of accumulated forest soil. It was a chamber, its corbelled ceiling intact, its interior space sufficient for standing, oriented towards the northeast in a manner she determined, through careful measurement, aligned precisely with the midsummer sunrise. She brought her findings to the attention of archaeologists at a nearby university. They visited, they observed, and they declared it a colonial root cellar. She requested an explanation for its astronomical alignment. They responded that such coincidences are known to occur. She inquired why a colonial farmer would construct a storage facility with a corbelled stone ceiling, requiring weeks of skilled labor, when wooden construction was both faster and more readily available. They suggested that colonial farmers sometimes engaged in unconventional practices. She asked for the structure to be dated. They declined. She located other researchers willing to accept samples for analysis. The results suggested an age of at least several thousand years, based on the organic material trapped in the soil layers beneath the foundation stones. The university archaeologists disputed the dating methodology. This pattern, the discovery, the dismissal, the contention, the ensuing silence, repeats itself in the New England stone chamber narrative with such regularity that it begins to feel less like a series of individual disagreements and more like a systematic response to evidence that fails to conform to the accepted paradigm. There is a reason for this systematic resistance. It is not purely academic. It is also legal. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, enacted in 1990, mandates that human remains and cultural artifacts discovered on federal land be returned to the Native American tribes with ancestral connections to that land. This is in principle a just and crucial law. Native American peoples endured generations of cultural and physical violence, and the theft and desecration of their sacred objects and ancestral remains constituted a part of that violence. However, the law creates a complex situation concerning evidence of pre-Columbian contact originating from outside North America. If structures in New England were built by peoples who arrived from Europe 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, those structures, and any associated remains, might not fall under the law's protection in the same manner. The legal and political implications are sufficiently complex that some researchers have suggested, cautiously and privately, that there exists institutional pressure against evidence that would complicate the existing legal framework. This is a significant claim and merits careful scrutiny. I am not suggesting a conspiracy. I am suggesting that human institutions, including academic ones, are not immune to the pressures of the social and political context in which they operate. The history of science is replete with instances where evidence was suppressed or disregarded, not due to ill intent, but because of structural incentives that rendered certain truths inconvenient. What I am suggesting is that the New England stone chambers warrant significantly more investigation than they have received, and that the reasons for this neglect are not purely scientific in nature. Let us delve deeper into the stones themselves, for there is considerably more here than the chambers of Vermont and New Hampshire. In the mountains of Pennsylvania, there lies a site known to local inhabitants for generations, yet it has received almost no academic scrutiny. It consists of a series of earthworks, low yet unmistakable ridges of soil and stone, forming geometric patterns across a hilltop, the kind of patterns that, in Ohio or the Mississippi Valley, would be immediately recognized as the work of the mound builders, the ancient cultures whose earthwork complexes constitute a genuine, acknowledged wonder of pre-Columbian North America. The mound builders, a broad, collective term for several related cultures referred to by archaeologists as Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippian, among others, constructed massive earthworks across the central and eastern United States over a period spanning roughly from 3,000 years ago to 1,000 years ago. They built burial mounds, ceremonial enclosures, and platform mounds of immense scale. The Great Serpent Mound in Ohio stretches for nearly a quarter of a mile. The Newark earthworks in the same state, before European settlement reduced them, covered 4 square miles and constituted the largest system of geometric earthworks in the world. These cultures are acknowledged. They are present in the textbooks. Their achievements are recognized, even celebrated, as evidence of the complexity and sophistication of pre-Columbian North American societies. What is less acknowledged, what resides at the uncomfortable edge of the accepted narrative, is the evidence that these cultures did not emerge from a vacuum, that they possess connections through trade, ideas, and potentially direct contact with cultures located much further afield than anyone has been comfortable admitting. During the 1960s, a researcher studying artifacts recovered from Hopewell burial mounds observed something unusual about the beads, pendants, and ornamental objects interred with the deceased. Some were crafted from materials that should not have been present. Copper was found in great quantities, sourced from the Great Lakes region. There was obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, traded across distances of 1,000 miles. However, there were also objects made from materials with no known North American source, objects that appeared uncomfortably similar to those that might have originated from across an ocean. There was silver worked in a style that certain metallurgists suggested resembled ancient Mediterranean techniques more than anything documented in the North American repertoire. There were textile impressions preserved in the soil around some artifacts, displaying weaving patterns with no known North American parallel. There were a handful of objects, quietly cataloged and not widely publicized, that seemed to contain plant materials, specifically traces of cocaine and nicotine, which should not have been present in North American archaeological contexts from 2,000 years ago. Cocaine is derived from the coca plant, which grows in South America. Nicotine, in the concentrations detected, suggested tobacco, which does grow in North America, yet the specific chemical signature was disputed. Some researchers examining the data argued that the contamination explanation was insufficient, that the concentrations were too high and too consistent to be the result of modern interference. This brings us to a broader and even more contested body of evidence. The evidence suggesting that oceanic contact between the ancient Old World and the ancient Americas was not merely possible, but factual, occurring not once, but repeatedly, not accidentally, but intentionally over a sustained period prior to Columbus's arrival. The conventional narrative of Columbus as discoverer, already modified by the acknowledgement of Norse presence at L'Anse aux Meadows, faces additional challenges from various directions. Genetic studies of pre-Columbian South American populations have identified DNA markers with origins in Polynesia, indicating that Polynesian sailors reached the west coast of South America perhaps a millennium ago. The sweet potato, a plant domesticated in South America, was present in Polynesia prior to European contact, and its distribution patterns strongly suggest human transport rather than natural drift. Chickens, which are not native to the Americas, have been found in pre-Columbian archaeological contexts in Chile, with dates suggesting they arrived from Polynesia before Columbus reached the Caribbean. The evidence for trans-Pacific contact is becoming increasingly robust with each new decade of research. The evidence for transatlantic contact is older, more fiercely contested, and in some ways more extraordinary. Let us return to the stones. There is a site in New Hampshire, distinct from the Salem location, smaller and less publicized, situated on a hilltop overlooking a river valley. The site comprises a single chamber, well constructed and well preserved, with an entrance passage oriented towards the winter solstice sunrise, and a series of standing stones arranged in an arc around the hilltop. These standing stones have been demonstrated through careful survey work to be positioned to mark the major solar and lunar events across the year: the solstices, the equinoxes, and what are termed the cross-quarter days. The days situated midway between the solstices and equinoxes, which held significance in the Celtic calendar as Imbolc, Beltane, Lugnasad, and Samhain, days that in Christian tradition became Candlemas, May Day, Lammas, and Halloween. The cross-quarter day alignments are significant because they are not natural features of the sky that any culture in the Northern Hemisphere would independently discover and mark. They are specific to a cultural tradition, a tradition that divides the year into 8 parts rather than 4. This tradition is documented in ancient Celtic and pre-Celtic Atlantic Europe. It is not documented in any known pre-Columbian North American culture. Yet the alignments are present. They are real. They can be measured. They are not coincidences. The researchers who have studied this site most carefully are not fringe figures. They include professional surveyors, astronomers, and geologists. They have published their findings in peer-reviewed journals, or at least attempted to. These attempts have encountered the kind of sustained resistance that, in any other field, would have prompted an investigation into the reviewers rather than the researchers. One astronomer, who spent 3 years surveying New England stone chamber sites with professional-grade equipment, documented over 60 sites with statistically significant astronomical alignments. She submitted her findings to 3 separate journals. Each rejected the paper without review, citing concerns about the underlying archaeological premise. She eventually published in an archaeoastronomy journal, where it received almost no response from mainstream archaeology. This is how paradigm suppression operates. It does not require conspiracy. It requires only that the individuals who control access to publication and funding share an assumption so deeply ingrained that they do not recognize it as an assumption. The assumption is that pre-Columbian North America was isolated from the Old World until Norse contact around 1,000 years ago, and that nothing built in North America before European settlement reflects contact with European traditions. That assumption is not a proven fact. It is a model, a framework, a theoretical starting point. And the evidence is beginning to accumulate on the other side of it in ways that cannot be ignored indefinitely. Allow me to share a very specific piece of that evidence, the kind that, once heard, does not fade from memory. In 1996, a skeleton was discovered eroding from a riverbank in Kennewick, Washington. The skeleton was approximately 9,000 years old. That in itself was remarkable, as 9,000-year-old human remains are rare anywhere in the world. However, what ignited a storm of controversy lasting nearly 2 decades was not the age of the skeleton, but its morphology, the physical characteristics of the skull and bones. The skeleton, dubbed Kennewick Man by the press, and the ancient one by the Native American tribes who claimed him as an ancestor, possessed a skull that did not resemble those of Northeast Asian-derived populations, the populations from whom all pre-Columbian Americans are supposed to have descended according to the Clovis first model. It appeared, to the forensic anthropologists who examined it, more similar to the skull of an Ainu, the indigenous people of Japan, or to skulls from ancient Southeast Asian populations, or even in some measurements, to ancient European populations. This was deeply inconvenient. 2 separate Native American tribal confederacies filed claims under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, seeking to have the remains returned and reinterred without further study. A group of scientists sued the Army Corps of Engineers, which controlled the land where the remains were discovered, for the right to study them. The legal battle persisted for 8 years. When the study was finally permitted, the results were, depending on one's perspective, either clarifying or deepening the enigma. Genetic analysis revealed that Kennewick Man was indeed related to Native Americans, but distantly, suggesting that the population diversity of early Americans was far greater than the simple Beringian land bridge model implied. He was not European or Ainu who had crossed the Pacific. He was a member of an early American population that may have been part of a more complex and diverse initial colonization than anyone had previously conceived. But the controversy surrounding Kennewick Man exposed something significant beyond his own DNA. It revealed how charged and politically intricate the question of who was first in the Americas had become. The law, the politics of indigenous sovereignty, academic careers constructed upon the existing model, museum collections organized around it. All of these elements created a web of incentives that rendered objective investigation exceedingly difficult. And within that charged, contested space, the stones of New England rest quietly, weathered by centuries of rain and frost, awaiting someone willing to examine them without predetermined conclusions. There is a cave in Alabama that most people have never encountered. It is called Russell Cave, and it has been recognized by archaeologists since the 1950s, when it was first professionally excavated. The cave was continuously utilized by humans for roughly 10,000 years, an extraordinary record of occupation providing researchers with a detailed cross-section of how human life in the American Southeast transformed across the millennia. What Russell Cave reveals, and this is not widely publicized but exists within the published archaeological literature for those who seek it, is that the people who inhabited it underwent a significant and relatively sudden change in their material culture around 3,000 years ago. Their pottery styles changed, their stone tool traditions changed, their burial practices changed. The change is abrupt enough in the archaeological record that it appears less like internal cultural evolution and more like contact, whether through trade or migration, with a different cultural tradition. 3,000 years ago, the same general period as the later stages of the Atlantic megalithic tradition in Europe, the same general period as the construction of the New England stone chambers. Correlation does not equal causation. Abrupt cultural change in an ancient society can have numerous explanations, but the pattern is striking, and it is not unique to Russell Cave. Across the eastern United States, within the archaeological literature accumulated over the past century and a half, there are recurring references to what researchers sometimes call horizon markers, moments in time when material culture changes abruptly across a wide geographic area, as if a new idea, a new population, or both had permeated the region. Some of these horizon changes can be explained by known events: the spread of agriculture, the adoption of new hunting technologies, migrations of known cultures from one region to another. Others remain unexplained, associated with material changes that seem to originate from outside the system, from somewhere the model insists nothing should have been coming. The stone chambers are the most visible and dramatic of these anomalies, but they are not alone. There is an inscription site in eastern Tennessee that has generated decades of debate. The site contains rock carvings, petroglyphs in conventional terminology, that local researchers have sought to interpret since they were first documented in the 19th century. Some carvings appear as abstract designs. Some resemble animal figures in a style consistent with known Native American traditions, but a portion of them, a small but persistent segment, appear as something else. They look like letters, not random marks, but structured characters with consistent forms that repeat in a manner suggesting an alphabet or syllabary. Barry Fell examined these inscriptions and discerned Ogham and Phoenician scripts. His interpretations were rejected. Yet the researchers who dismissed his interpretations did not always offer alternative explanations for why the carvings appeared as structured writing. The more comfortable academic response was to categorize them as abstract designs and proceed. A more recent researcher, approaching the same site with different training and without Fell's particular preconceptions, documented the carvings using high-resolution photogrammetry, a technique that produces extremely precise three-dimensional maps of rock surfaces. His documentation revealed that the carvings were more extensive than previous researchers had realized, and that they possessed a structural organization across the rock face that seemed deliberate, that seemed to follow rules, that seemed to be doing something that random mark-making does not. He presented his findings at a conference. The reception was polite but dismissive. He was informed that pattern recognition is a powerful human bias, that we perceive structure where none exists, that the mind imposes meaning upon random marks. He returned home and spent 2 more years with the data. He came back with a statistical analysis demonstrating that the distribution of marks on the rock face was not consistent with random or semi-random design making, that the probability of the observed distribution arising by chance was vanishingly small, and that the structural features of the marks were consistent with a phonetic writing system, specifically with characteristics of ancient Semitic writing systems from the Eastern Mediterranean. His statistical analysis has not been refuted. It has been ignored. This is the frustrating rhythm of this narrative. Evidence accumulates. It is not refuted. It is simply disregarded. The model continues. The stones continue to rest in the New England forests, aligned to the solstice, roofed with slabs that no colonial farmer had any motivation to place in that orientation, waiting. Let us consider what the Native American oral traditions convey about this. Because here is something that often gets lost in the debate between Fells enthusiasts and the academic establishment. The Native American peoples of New England did not build these stone chambers. That much is generally agreed upon. The Abenaki, Nipmuc, Wampanoag, Mahican, and Mohawk peoples, who inhabited New England when European colonists arrived, did not construct core-belt stone chambers. Their building traditions were different. They constructed structures appropriate to their mobile, seasonally adaptive lifestyles. Longhouses, wigwams, and temporary camps, structures that did not demand the enormous labor investment that a stone chamber requires. When early European colonists inquired of Native American elders about the stone chambers, the responses varied but shared a common theme. These were not built by us. These were here when our people arrived. These are old. These belong to the time before. This is remarkable testimony. It is not proof of ancient European contact. It could signify many things. It could mean that an earlier Native American culture, one that did not survive into the contact period, constructed these structures. It could mean that the structures are genuinely old enough that oral memory, which can preserve information for extraordinarily long periods in some traditions, but not indefinitely in all, had simply lost the specific knowledge of their builders. But it could also mean what it appears to convey, that the structures were already ancient when the ancestors of the contact period tribes arrived in the region, and that no one in living or remembered experience had constructed them. There are traditions among some northeastern tribes of a people who preceded them, sometimes referred to as the Stone People or the Little People, sometimes described in terms suggesting they differed physically or culturally from the tribes who displaced or absorbed them. These traditions are fragmentary, and their interpretation is contested. They have been seized upon by some researchers seeking confirmation of ancient European contact, and dismissed by others as mythological rather than historical. The truth likely resides somewhere in the middle, as is often the case. What the traditions do suggest is that the Native American peoples of New England were aware that the stone structures in their landscape possessed a history predating their own, and they treated those structures with a mixture of respect and distance, suggesting they understood them to be significant, to be places of power, even if the specific cultural tradition that had created them was lost. This is worth contemplating. The same stones that Europeans dismissed as root sellers were being recognized by the indigenous peoples who lived among them as ancient, powerful, and not of their own creation. Two different cultures, observing the same stones from two different perspectives, both grasping something crucial, that these things are genuinely old, genuinely intentional, and genuinely mysterious. The only people who seemed certain about what the stones were, certain enough to cease investigation, were the academic archaeologists who needed them to be root sellers because the alternative was unacceptable. Let me transport you now to a specific location, a specific hillside in Vermont, at a specific time of year, because the experience of being present at the right moment is something that does not translate fully into words, but that I wish to attempt to convey. It is the morning of the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, around December 21st. The hill is blanketed in deep snow. The birch trees are bare, their white bark almost luminous in the pre-dawn gray. The chamber entrance, a low rectangular opening in the hillside, faces a gap between two hills to the northeast, a gap that in summer is filled with trees and shadow, but in winter, with the leaves gone and the sun at its most southerly arc, frames something specific. You sit at the back of the chamber. The interior smells of cold earth and ancient stone. The core-belt ceiling curves above you, granite slabs fitted with a precision that impresses even now. Your breath forms small clouds. The sky begins to lighten. The gap between the hills, framed perfectly by the entrance passage, brightens. And then, at the precise moment of the solstice sunrise, the first direct light of the sun enters the chamber, travels down the passage, and strikes the back wall in a bright rectangle of gold. It lasts for perhaps 20 minutes. The rectangle of light moves slowly across the back wall as the sun rises. Then the angle changes, the light cuts off, and the chamber is gray and cold once more. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing. They selected this location because of that gap between those hills. They oriented the entrance passage to capture that specific sunrise at that specific time of year. They constructed the chamber deep enough and precise enough for the effect to work, for the rectangle of light to reach the back wall without hitting the sides or the ceiling. This required observation over multiple years, calculation, and construction skill that is by any measure sophisticated. And they accomplished this, according to the best available dating, sometime between 2,000 and 4,000 years ago. For whom? For what purpose? The purpose is easier to speculate upon than the who. In virtually every ancient culture that constructed astronomical monuments, from Newgrange in Ireland to Karnak in Egypt to Chichen Itza in Mexico, the solstice was a moment of profound ritual significance. It was the turning point of the year, the moment when the sun ceases its apparent retreat and begins its return. In a world devoid of the certainties of the Gregorian calendar, without the assurance of digital clocks, weather forecasts, and grocery stores, the return of the sun was not a minor astronomical fact. It was a matter of survival. It was the promise that the cold would not persist forever, that the days would lengthen, that the earth would warm, that the crops would grow, or the game would return. The solstice was worth celebrating, worth marking in stone. But you do not mark the solstice in a chamber of dry-laid granite on a Vermont hillside, unless you possess the cultural tradition that understands why it matters to do so in that specific way, in stone, with permanence, with the chamber as a womb and the light as a seed. That cultural tradition is documented in Atlantic Europe. It is not documented in pre-Columbian North America. I want to be precise here, because this matters. I am not asserting that pre-Columbian North American peoples lacked sophistication or did not engage in astronomical observation. They absolutely did. The medicine wheels of the Great Plains serve as astronomical observatories. The Cahokia Woodhenge near St. Louis employed a ring of massive wooden posts to mark the solstice horizon. The great kiva complexes of the Chacoan culture in New Mexico incorporated astronomical alignments into their architecture in ways that demonstrate profound knowledge of the sky. What I am saying is that the specific combination of elements present at the New England stone chamber sites, corbelled dry stone construction, enclosed interior spaces, solstice and cross-quarter day alignments, the particular configuration of passage, chamber, and standing stones, is not found in any known pre-Columbian North American culture. It is found in Atlantic Europe, specifically within the megalithic tradition of Ireland, Brittany, and Iberia. The simplest explanation for its presence in both locations is contact. The alternative, independent invention, necessitates believing that peoples on both sides of the Atlantic, separated by an ocean with no known mechanism for cultural exchange, independently developed not just the same idea, the astronomical chamber, but the same specific technical solution to that idea, corbelled dry stone construction, and the same specific astronomical focus, the solstice and cross-quarter alignments, and deployed these in the same specific cultural manner as permanent communal monuments in the landscape. Independent invention does occur. It is well documented in the history of human technology. But independent invention of this degree of specificity strains credibility in a way that becomes increasingly difficult to defend as more details are accumulated. There is a mathematician who has spent several years applying statistical analysis to the question of the New England chambers and their European analogs. He has compared the dimensions, proportions, orientations, and construction techniques of the New England sites with their counterparts in Ireland and Brittany. His analysis, reviewed by several colleagues with relevant expertise in statistics and archaeoastronomy, suggests that the probability of the observed similarities arising from independent invention is astronomically low. He submitted his analysis to 3 journals. None reviewed it. He posted it on an academic preprint server where anyone can read it. It has been downloaded several thousand times. It has been cited in several dozen subsequent papers. The mainstream archaeological journals have not engaged with it. The silence is not ignorance. It is a choice. Now, nothing I have described so far proves contact. Proof in archaeology, as in most historical sciences, is rarely absolute. What accumulates is the weight of evidence, the pattern of findings that point in a consistent direction, even as individual pieces remain ambiguous. The weight of evidence surrounding the New England stone chambers, considered together, taken seriously, taken without the prior assumption that contact was impossible, points towards the possibility, the genuine possibility, that people from the Atlantic megalithic tradition of Bronze Age Europe reached North America, not one individual, not one ship, but sustained, if perhaps episodic, contact across the North Atlantic over a period of perhaps several centuries, beginning perhaps 4,000 years ago, and tapering off perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, leaving behind a scattering of stone monuments and possibly genetic traces and cultural memories that we are only beginning to seek seriously. If that contact occurred, it transforms the story of America in profound ways. It changes our understanding of who constructed the first permanent structures on this continent. It changes what we perceive the Native American peoples of the Northeast inherited, transformed, and were shaped by. It changes the relationship between American prehistory and the wider story of human movement and connection across the planet. It does not diminish the achievements of the indigenous peoples of North America. It expands the story of human connection to include them within a broader network of contact and exchange, which upon reflection is entirely consistent with everything else we know about human behavior. We do not remain confined to one place. We do not isolate ourselves. We cross the water when we possess the technology and the will. We follow the stars. The Bronze Age people of Atlantic Europe followed the stars. Their monuments attest to this. The question is how far they followed them. Let us journey to a very specific place now, a location that most people interested in this subject have never encountered, because it resides at the intersection of several lines of evidence that, taken together, paint a picture that is genuinely extraordinary. There is a town in Vermont called Royalton. It sits in the White River Valley, in a landscape of rounded hills and river-bottom farms that is quintessentially New England in its appearance, the kind of place that graces autumn calendars and tourist postcards. And on a hillside above the town, in a stretch of forest that the locals know about but rarely visit, there is a site that has been the subject of quiet, careful investigation for several decades by a small group of researchers who know what they are seeking. The site consists, at its core, of a single large stone chamber, well-built and well-preserved, with an interior space of roughly 8 feet by 12 feet, and a ceiling that peaks at about 7 feet. The entrance is oriented to the east-northeast, aligned with the summer solstice sunrise. Around the chamber, within a radius of perhaps 300 feet, there are a series of standing stones, some still upright, some fallen, some barely visible under the accumulated debris of centuries of forest growth. But what distinguishes the Royalton site from other New England chambers? What makes it the object of particular interest is what emerges when you survey the interior with care. The interior walls of the chamber are not rough. They are not the tumble and stack construction of a hasty field worker or a colonial farmer making do with local materials. They are fitted. Each stone has been selected and placed with precision, the faces smoothed, the joints tight. And on several of the interior stones, on surfaces that would have been protected from weathering by their interior position, there are marks. The marks are not random. They do not resemble the natural fracture patterns of the stone. They are incised, deliberately cut into the stone surface with a tool that left a regular, clean groove, and they form patterns, not pictures, not representational images, but structured arrangements of lines that repeat across several stones in ways that suggest a system. Several researchers have examined these marks over the years. Their interpretations differ in specifics. Some see agam. Others perceive something closer to a proto-runic script. Still others are unwilling to commit to any specific identification. But there is a consensus among those who have actually spent time in the chamber and examined the marks carefully. These are deliberate incised characters in some form of notation system. They are not modern, not colonial, and not attributable to any known Native American tradition. The marks have not been directly dated. Direct dating of rock incisions is technically very challenging, and results are often disputed. What the researchers have focused on instead is contextual dating, using the surrounding soil layers and the associated standing stones to establish that the site was in use during a period consistent with the Bronze Age or earlier. One of the standing stones at the Royalton site is a quartz-bearing granite pillar, about 6 feet tall and roughly circular in cross-section. It stands at the edge of what appears to be a cleared area, a space that may once have been more open before the forest reclaimed it. The stone is oriented, when measured carefully, to point towards the winter solstice sunrise at the horizon distance from the chamber entrance. Quartz is significant in the megalithic tradition of Atlantic Europe. Quartz played an important role. Many megalithic monuments, including Newgrange in Ireland, were decorated with or constructed using white quartz, sometimes in large quantities. The exact meaning of quartz in this tradition is debated, but its presence is not accidental. Quartz possesses unusual physical properties, including piezoelectricity, the generation of an electrical charge when mechanically stressed, and a distinctive luminous quality under certain light conditions. Whatever its symbolic role in the megalithic tradition, it was recognized as a material with special properties and deliberately incorporated into monuments. The quartz pillar at Royalton is not proof of anything by itself. Vermont is abundant in quartz-bearing granite, but in the context of the aligned chamber and the associated inscribed stones, it adds to a picture that is, at minimum, worth taking seriously. There is a researcher, now in his late 70s, living in rural Vermont, who has dedicated the better part of 40 years to studying these sites. His name appears on numerous papers published in small journals and in conference proceedings of an organization called the New England Antiquities Research Association, an organization that has been the primary academic home for researchers interested in the New England stone chambers since its founding in 1964. NERA, as it is known, is not a fringe organization. Its membership has included professional archaeologists, astronomers, geologists, and historians, as well as knowledgeable amateurs. Its journal has published peer-reviewed papers, including contributions from researchers with full academic credentials. It has been dismissed by mainstream archaeology as outside the acceptable boundaries of the discipline. The researcher I am describing has, over 40 years, documented more than 70 stone chamber sites in Vermont and New Hampshire. He has surveyed them with professional equipment. He has collected samples for analysis. He has built relationships with Native American scholars who take the question of the sites seriously, even if they do not all agree on the conclusions. He told an interviewer a few years ago that the thing he finds most remarkable about the New England stone chambers is not what they are, or who built them, or how old they are. What he finds most remarkable is that they exist at all, that they survive, that no one dismantled them, repurposed them, or used the stones for something else, as happened to thousands of megalithic monuments in Europe during the agricultural period. The New England chambers survived because the forests grew up around them, and the colonial farmers who encountered them decided, for whatever reason, to leave them undisturbed. They made this decision in part because the local people informed them that the stones were ancient, strange, and should not be disturbed. The stones survived because people on 2 continents independently recognized that they deserve to endure. There is something in that worth contemplating, Let us now turn to a different kind of evidence. Evidence that resides not in stones but in genes. Genetic research into the origins of Native American populations has been one of the most rapidly evolving areas of science over the past 2 decades, driven by improvements in DNA extraction and analysis that have made it possible to recover and interpret genetic material from ancient samples that would previously have been unusable. The broad outlines of the story are well established. The ancestors of Native American peoples originated in Northeast Asia, crossed Beringia, and spread through the Americas. The genetic signature is clear and consistent across virtually all Native American populations tested. But within that broad picture, there are some unusual findings. Researchers studying the genetics of the Algonquian-speaking peoples of the northeastern United States, which includes the tribes of New England, have found a genetic marker called haplogroup X2A that is not found in Asian populations, and whose closest relatives are found in populations of the Middle East and Europe. X2A is present in several northeastern Native American tribes, including the Ojibwe and the Algonquin, at frequencies between 5 and 25%. The mainstream explanation for haplogroup X2A is that it was present in the original Beringian population at low frequencies, was carried into North America with the initial migration, and then drifted to higher frequencies in certain northeastern populations by chance. This is possible. Genetic drift in small populations can produce apparently anomalous distributions. But the alternative explanation, one proposed early in the discovery of X2A and never fully dismissed, is that haplogroup X2A arrived in North America independently, carried by a population that crossed the Atlantic from the Middle East or Europe at some point prior to the general mixing of the historical period. This alternative is genetically possible. The question is whether there is sufficient evidence from other directions to make it credible. The New England stone chambers provide evidence from another direction. The question of whether evidence from multiple independent directions, genetic, archaeological, astronomical, cultural, all pointing towards the same general conclusion, should be taken more seriously than each individual line of evidence would suggest on its own, is not a fringe methodological question. It is standard scientific practice in every field where direct experimentation is impossible and where one is dealing with past events. In geology, astronomy, and evolutionary biology, the convergence of evidence from multiple independent sources is precisely how one builds confident conclusions about things one cannot directly observe. In American archaeology, the convergence of evidence towards pre-Columbian transatlantic contact has been treated not as a reason for increased confidence, but as a reason for increased dismissal. Each individual line of evidence is dismissed on its own terms, and the convergence is ignored because to take it seriously would necessitate revising the model. That is not how science is supposed to operate. Let me recount a moment in this story that I find particularly revealing. In the 1970s, a researcher named Cyrus Gordon, who was at the time a professor of Mediterranean studies at Brandeis University and one of the foremost authorities in the world on ancient Semitic languages, examined an inscribed stone that had been discovered in a burial mound in Tennessee in 1885. The stone, known as the Bat Creek Stone, had been excavated by a Smithsonian archaeologist named John Emmert and had been in the Smithsonian's collections ever since. The Smithsonian's interpretation of the inscription on the stone was that it was Cherokee or possibly a series of native symbols without specific linguistic meaning. Gordon examined the stone and recognized it immediately as Paleo-Hebrew, the archaic form of the Hebrew script used in ancient Israel before the Babylonian captivity of the 6th century BCE. He could read it. He published a paper asserting this, identifying the characters as clearly and unmistakably Paleo-Hebrew and providing a translation. The response from the Smithsonian was that Gordon was incorrect. Gordon was one of the most qualified individuals in the world to make precisely this identification. He had spent his career reading exactly these kinds of inscriptions. His identification of the script was subsequently confirmed by other experts in Paleo-Hebrew who examined the published photographs independently. The Smithsonian maintained its position. The Back Creek stone was eventually subjected to radiocarbon dating, not of the stone itself, but of wood fragments from the same context in the burial mound. The dates suggested the burial dated to somewhere between 32 BCE and 769 CE, a range entirely consistent with the period of Paleo-Hebrew inscription use, and entirely inconsistent with any Cherokee tradition that could explain the characters. The Smithsonian acknowledged the dating results but continued to dispute the linguistic identification. The stone remained in the collections, its Hebrew inscription acknowledged by specialists in ancient Semitic languages and denied by the institution that held it for another several decades. A more recent analysis, published in 2004, employed additional dating techniques on the burial context and confirmed the antiquity of the deposit. The researchers, who included specialists in both ancient languages and archaeological dating, concluded that the evidence was consistent with the presence of someone from a Semitic cultural tradition in a Tennessee burial mound sometime within the first several centuries of the Common Era. The mainstream archaeological response was silence. I am not asserting that the Back Creek stone proves ancient Semitic contact with North America. I am stating that the standard of evidence being applied to this question is not the standard of evidence applied to other questions in American archaeology. If a stone with Cherokee characters had been discovered in a Turkish burial mound, and a linguist identified it as Cherokee, the response would not be decades of institutional denial. The response would be extraordinary excitement and extensive investigation. The double standard is itself evidence, not of ancient contact, but of an institutional commitment to the existing model that exceeds what the evidence actually warrants. There are other inscribed stones in the record. There is the Grave Creek stone, found in a burial mound in West Virginia in 1838, covered with characters that scholars have variously identified as Phoenician, Libyan, Runic, and Etruscan. The stone was lost for many years before re-emerging in a museum collection, which has complicated authentication. There is the Davenport tablet, found in Iowa in 1877, a stone tablet with what appear to be astronomical symbols and possibly phonetic characters. There is the Paraíba inscription, found in Brazil in 1872, a text in Phoenician script describing a voyage from the Eastern Mediterranean, so detailed and linguistically accurate that even scholars who believe it to be a modern forgery struggle to explain how a forger in 19th century Brazil could have possessed sufficient knowledge of Phoenician language and script to produce something that reads as convincingly as it does. Each of these artifacts has been disputed. Each has been the subject of arguments that have not been definitively resolved in either direction. The pattern of their discovery, examination, the controversies surrounding them, and ultimately their dismissal or marginalization is itself a pattern worth examining. What does it signify that repeatedly across nearly 2 centuries of American archaeology, anomalous evidence of possible ancient contact has been discovered, studied, disputed, and ultimately sidelined? It could indicate that all of the artifacts are hoaxes or misidentifications, that the archaeological anomalies have mundane explanations, that the genetic data reflects drift rather than migration, that the stone chambers are root cellars after all. Or it could indicate something else. It could indicate that the model we have constructed is not incorrect at its core, not incorrect about the Baronian migration and the deep Asian ancestry of Native American peoples, but incorrect in what it excludes. Incorrect in insisting that the Americas were sealed off from Old World contact for 12,000 years. Incorrect in treating isolation as the default condition and contact as requiring an impossible burden of proof. Human beings do not remain static. We cross water when we have boats, and people have had boats for longer than the Clovis first model would prefer. We follow food, trade, and curiosity. We are, by a considerable margin, the most migratory large mammal on the planet. The notion that the North Atlantic was uncrossable for the entirety of the Bronze Age, for 2,000 or 3,000 years, during which people were constructing ocean-going vessels in both the Mediterranean and Northern Europe, is a claim that requires justification by evidence, not assumption because the model demands it. The stones of New England are indifferent to the model's requirements. They rest on their hillsides. Their entrances face the solstice. Their chambers gather the light at the turning of the year. They are ancient. They are intentional. They were built by someone for reasons important enough to justify enormous labor, and we do not know who. That is the honest answer. We do not know who. The evidence points in a direction, but it does not lead to a certified destination. The people who constructed the chambers may have been visitors, Bronze Age sailors from the Atlantic coast of Europe who established a temporary or seasonal presence in New England before contact faded. They may have been migrants, people who came and stayed and were absorbed into or displaced by the populations already present. They may have been something in between, a small but persistent trading or ceremonial community that left monuments but few other traces. Or the model may require revision in a direction we have not yet imagined. The chambers may be the work of a Native American culture, one whose full story we have not yet recovered, whose stoneworking traditions were more sophisticated than we currently understand, and whose astronomical knowledge assumed forms that appear familiar to us because astronomical observation leads people to similar conclusions regardless of cultural origin. That last possibility is also real. We should not close our minds to it. What we should not do is simply decree that the chambers are root cellars and cease investigation. Because when you cease looking, you cease knowing. And there is much here that we do not yet know. Let me now describe what occurs underground at these sites, because the chambers are only part of what is present. At several of the larger New England sites, researchers employing ground-penetrating radar, a technique that allows visualization of subsurface features without excavation, have identified anomalies beneath and around the visible chambers. These anomalies suggest buried structures, additional chambers, or passages, or foundations that are not visible on the surface. The standing chambers are, in some cases, only the parts of a larger complex that happen to have survived into the present. At the Salem site in New Hampshire, ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1990s revealed what appeared to be a network of tunnels or passages extending beyond the visible walls of the complex. These passages have not been excavated. Their extent and character are unknown, but their existence indicates that what is visible above ground may be only a fraction of what was constructed, and that the full site, if properly excavated, might reveal a complexity that would be more difficult to dismiss than the surface features alone. At the Royalton site in Vermont, a different kind of subsurface anomaly was identified. The radar data suggested not a tunnel, but a hollow space, a chamber roughly twice the size of the visible chamber adjacent to it, and possibly connected by a passage that had collapsed. If this buried chamber is real, and if it can be safely excavated, it might contain artifacts, organic materials, anything that might allow the site to be dated and understood more precisely. These subsurface features have not been excavated. The reasons are multiple. Excavation requires permits, and permits require the approval of state archaeologists, and state archaeologists are part of the institutional framework that has generally not taken the stone chamber sites seriously. Fundraising for excavation is difficult when the sites are not recognized by mainstream archaeology as significant. And there is the persistent legal uncertainty about who exactly has authority over these sites, and what obligations would arise from the discovery of human remains or cultural materials within them. The result is that the most potentially informative aspects of the sites remain undisturbed, unexamined, and unknown. There is a particular irony in this situation. American archaeology is simultaneously one of the most active and one of the most constrained archaeological traditions in the world. The United States possesses extensive federal and state laws governing archaeological excavation. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, state-level historic preservation statutes, all create a legal framework intended to protect the cultural heritage of the indigenous peoples of North America. But this framework, which is in principle a good thing, has a side effect that is less positive. It makes it very difficult to investigate sites that fall outside the accepted categories of American prehistory, the stone chambers, because they do not fit neatly into any recognized Native American cultural tradition, and because their European analogs are politically sensitive, exist in a legal and institutional no man's land, where no one is quite certain who has the authority to excavate them, who would benefit from the excavation, and who bears the responsibility for protecting whatever is discovered. And so they remain unexcavated. The ground-penetrating radar anomalies remain uninvestigated. The inscribed stones remain undated. The astronomical alignments remain unacknowledged in the mainstream literature. And the stones rest on their hillsides, patient as they have always been, not requiring our understanding in order to exist. There is something almost dignified about that. Let me shift now to a wider perspective, because the New England chambers are part of a larger pattern that extends across the entire continent. A pattern of anomalies and unexplained findings that together constitute what might be called the case for a more complex American prehistory. In the American Southwest, specifically in a stretch of the Four Corners region, there are petroglyphs and pictographs that have been studied by dozens of researchers over the past century. The mainstream interpretation of these images is that they represent the work of the ancestral Puebloan peoples and their predecessors, cultural expressions of a Native American tradition that is well documented in the archaeological record. But some of the images do not fit. Some depict animals that are not native to North America, animals that resemble elephants or rhinos, animals that some researchers identify as representations of the Pleistocene megafauna that went extinct at the end of the last ice age, 10 to 12,000 years ago. If these images are what they appear to be, they are among the oldest representational art in North America, made by people who saw living mastodons or mammoths or giant ground sloths. Some of these images resemble something else: ships. Specifically, they resemble the reed boats or papyrus boats of ancient Mediterranean traditions, with a particular hull profile and rigging configuration that does not resemble anything from the Great Plains or the Colorado Plateau, but that appears familiar to anyone who has studied ancient Egyptian or Phoenician maritime art. These images have been recognized for a long time. They are in the rock art databases. They are documented and unexplained. There is a site in the Mojave Desert in California where a series of petroglyphs, many clearly in the tradition of the indigenous peoples of the region, includes a subset that has been the focus of intense scrutiny for decades. The subset consists of characters arranged in rows with a regularity of spacing and orientation that suggests a writing system. Multiple independent researchers have proposed identifications ranging from Libyan to Phoenician to an ancient Canaanite script. The site, called the Mojave Desert Inscriptions, has been documented but not officially interpreted by the relevant state and federal agencies. The recurring pattern here is worth naming explicitly. Across the American archaeological record, from Vermont to Tennessee to Iowa to California, there are inscribed stones, rock art panels, and artifact assemblages that contain elements that do not conform to the accepted pre-Columbian North American cultural inventory. Each one is individually dismissible. The Back Creek stone could be a fake. The New England chamber inscriptions could be natural marks misread by pattern-hungry researchers. The Mojave petroglyphs could be geometric designs of indigenous origin that happen to resemble Mediterranean scripts. But all of them together, the convergence, the pattern, the consistent direction in which the anomalies point, is not so easily dismissed. And underneath all of them, providing the anomalies with a possible mechanism, is the question of the ocean. Could people have crossed it? Could they have crossed it repeatedly, in both directions over a period of centuries before the recorded beginning of the contact period? The answer to this question has changed significantly in the past 2 decades. Experimental archaeologists have built and sailed reconstructed Bronze Age vessels on ocean routes that the existing model says should not have been traveled. A team of researchers sailed a reconstructed Bronze Age trading vessel from France to Ireland to Scotland, demonstrating that the North Atlantic was navigable with the technology of 3,000 years ago. Another team, using a reconstruction of an ancient skin boat of the type used by Inuit ancestors, sailed the reverse of the proposed transatlantic route, from Iceland towards Greenland and then along the Labrador coast, demonstrating that the route was not just theoretically possible, but practically achievable. The question of whether Bronze Age Europeans could have crossed the Atlantic has been answered experimentally. They could have. The question that remains is whether they did. The stones of New England make it harder to assert that they did not. We have been moving through this story at a steady pace, gathering evidence, following threads, and sitting with the uncertainty that honest inquiry demands. But there is another dimension to this story, one that is harder to quantify, but that I think is important to name, and that is what this question means. What hangs on the answer? What is actually at stake? The official story of American prehistory, the Clovis first model, and everything built upon it, is not just an academic theory. It is bound up with legal frameworks, with political arrangements, with the ongoing struggle of indigenous peoples for recognition, sovereignty, and justice. Any revision of the story carries risks of being used, as false histories have always been used, to serve agendas that have nothing to do with the truth. There is a long and ugly tradition of using claimed evidence of ancient European or Semitic contact with the Americas to undermine the legitimacy of indigenous peoples' claims to their land and their history. Mormon theology includes a belief in ancient Hebrews crossing the Atlantic and becoming the ancestors of Native American peoples, a belief that many Native American scholars regard, with justification, as an attempt to appropriate and rewrite their history. Various white nationalist and neo-Nazi groups have claimed that Vikings or ancient Aryans were the true founders of American civilization, a claim that is both historically false and morally poisonous. These misuses of the question make it politically charged in ways that extend well beyond the academic debate. Researchers who study pre-Columbian contact are aware that they are operating in a field where legitimate inquiry is difficult to distinguish, in the public eye, from the kind of pseudo-history that serves racist or religiously motivated agendas. This is a genuine problem. It contributes to the institutional reluctance to take the evidence seriously, because taking it seriously means entering a space that has been contaminated by bad actors, and where the risk of being associated with those bad actors is real and professionally damaging. But the solution to the misuse of evidence is not to suppress the evidence. The solution is to be rigorous about what the evidence actually indicates, careful about the conclusions it actually supports, and honest about the distinction between legitimate inquiry and politically motivated pseudo-history. The New England stone chambers do not prove that white Europeans were the true founders of American civilization. They suggest that Bronze Age people from Atlantic Europe may have reached North America and left stone monuments that survive in the New England landscape. That is a different claim, and it does not diminish or undermine the history, the culture, the sovereignty, or the humanity of the indigenous peoples of North America. In fact, in one sense, it expands the frame of the story in a way that might be of interest to Native American scholars. If the ancestors of some northeastern tribes encountered Bronze Age Europeans, traded with them, absorbed some of them, remembered them in oral traditions as a people who had been here before, then the indigenous history of North America is even richer and more complex than the accepted story allows. It includes contact with the wider world at a time when that contact was occurring across much of the ocean-connected globe. The human world was not, in the Bronze Age, a collection of hermetically sealed cultural compartments. It was a connected, mobile, trading, sometimes colliding network of peoples who moved along coasts and across seas with more regularity and more purpose than we have generally credited them. North America was part of that world. The stones of New England may be the evidence. Let me now take you into the very specific and very strange story of a research project that took place in the early 1980s, a project that was never completed, whose findings were never fully published, and whose principal investigator died before he could bring the work to a conclusion. His name was James Whittall. He was an archaeologist trained in the European tradition who had spent years excavating megalithic sites in Ireland and Britain before he became interested in the New England chambers. He was one of the founding figures of the New England Antiquities Research Association, and he brought to the study of the chambers the same methodological rigor he had applied to his European work. Whittall became convinced through years of careful observation that the New England chambers were not root cellars and were not Native American structures, but represented a genuine connection to the Atlantic megalithic tradition. He was cautious about how far he took this conclusion in public, aware of the institutional resistance he would face. But in his private correspondence and in papers shared within NERA, he was increasingly direct about what he believed he was observing. In the early 1980s, Whittall organized a systematic survey of a cluster of chamber sites in central Vermont. The survey was intended to produce a comprehensive documentation of the sites, their dimensions, their orientations, their construction techniques, and any associated features, including inscriptions. He assembled a team of volunteers with relevant skills, including surveyors, photographers, and geologists, and they spent several field seasons working through the sites methodically. The survey produced an archive: maps, photographs, measured drawings, field notes, soil samples, a comprehensive record of what the sites contained and how they were constructed. And among the material Whittall collected were documented inscriptions from several sites, inscriptions that he believed, based on his knowledge of European megalithic traditions, were genuine examples of ancient writing. Whittall passed away in 1994 without completing his planned publication of the survey results. The archive he had created passed to NERA, where it has been partially preserved. Some of it has been published in NERA's journal. Some of it remains in storage. What the archive contains, according to the researchers who have had access to it, is the most systematic documentation of the New England chamber sites ever assembled. It is more comprehensive than anything the academic establishment has produced because the academic establishment has not attempted to produce it. The archive is not secret. It is not suppressed. It is simply archived within an organization that does not possess the institutional resources of a major university, waiting for someone to complete the work that Whittall began. There is something in this story that I find very moving. A man dedicated decades of his life to carefully documenting something that the institutions around him refused to take seriously. He built an archive. He organized a community of researchers. He believed, based on evidence, that the stones he was studying were important, that they were telling a story that history had forgotten, and that the story deserved to be told accurately and with care. He passed away without seeing that story told. The archive remains in boxes. The stones remain on the hillsides. The forest grows around them. And somewhere in Vermont, on a December morning, when the angle of the sun is exactly right, light enters a chamber that has been waiting for it, travels down a passage aligned by someone who understood the sky, and strikes a wall of granite that has held that light for thousands of years, and then passes, and the chamber is gray and cold once more. There is a researcher named David Barron who has dedicated the better part of 3 decades to studying the stonework traditions of southern New England, with particular attention to what he calls structured stone landscapes, arrangements of stones in the landscape that appear to serve functions beyond simple property markers or agricultural clearing. Barron is not a credentialed archaeologist. He is a careful observer with a deep local knowledge of the landscape and a willingness to examine what is actually present, rather than what the accepted model says should be present. What Barron has documented, across hundreds of site visits and thousands of photographs and detailed sketch maps, is that the landscape of southern New England is, in a sense, written in stone. Not just in the chambers and standing stones that receive the most attention, but in smaller features. Cairns, perched rocks, stone rows, and alignments that cover the landscape at a density that is not consistent with agricultural clearing or casual property demarcation. These smaller features are ubiquitous. They are found in town forests, on the edges of farms, and in the backyards of suburban houses. They are documented in town histories and old maps. They have always been present, and the conventional archaeological interpretation of them is that they are colonial, the byproduct of farmers clearing fields of glacially deposited rocks and piling them into convenient rows and cairns. Barron's argument is that, while some of these features are undoubtedly colonial, others are not. The density of stone features in some areas is too great to be explained by agricultural clearing. The positioning of many features in relation to each other, to the landscape, and to astronomical events is too precise to be accidental. And the construction techniques of some of the cairns and stone rows are identical to construction techniques documented in the pre-Christian megalithic traditions of Europe. He has been advancing this argument for 20 years. He has documented it carefully. He has presented it in public forums and in small publications. The mainstream archaeological community of New England has not engaged with his work. This is a pattern in the academic culture of American archaeology. There are things you can study and things you cannot. You can study Native American cultures with the full methodological rigor of modern archaeology, and important work is being done in that area. You can study colonial American material culture, which has a rich and well-funded tradition. You can study the Norse in Newfoundland, which is safely limited to a single site and a specific cultural tradition. But you cannot seriously study the possibility of pre-Norse transatlantic contact without placing yourself outside the boundaries of mainstream archaeology, without being associated with fringe theories, wishful thinking, and possible racism. The cost of that association is high enough that rational, evidence-respecting researchers who might otherwise investigate these questions choose not to. The field is left to enthusiasts, amateurs, and the occasional maverick academic willing to pay the professional cost. And the stones wait. Now, I want to discuss what a genuine investigation of these sites might entail, what it would require, and what it might reveal, because I think it is important to be concrete about what is being overlooked and what could be accomplished. A genuine investigation would commence with the systematic archaeological excavation of at least one major chamber site, employing full professional protocols and a multidisciplinary team including archaeologists, geologists, archaeoastronomers, linguists familiar with ancient Atlantic scripts, and indigenous scholars from the relevant tribal nations. The excavation would aim to recover organic materials, charcoal, seeds, wood, bone, anything that can be dated from sealed contexts associated with the construction and use of the chamber. Some of those objects of unknown origin have been examined by researchers who work in the area of ancient material culture from outside North America. Some of the worked copper objects from Hopewell sites exhibit manufacturing techniques more consistent with Old World metalwork traditions than with anything documented in North American prehistory. Some of the textile impressions from Hopewell burial contexts display weaving patterns that, again, lack clear North American analogs. And some Hopewell burial sites contain what appear to be systematic arrangements of artifacts that, to certain researchers, look as though they were assembled according to a logic that makes sense within a Mediterranean religious context, specifically within the context of ancient mystery religions that employed specific combinations of ritual objects in their ceremonies. This is highly speculative territory. I want to be clear about that. The researchers who have made these observations are working at the edge of what the evidence supports. But they are working with the evidence, not inventing it. The Hopewell culture collapsed around 1500 years ago, relatively suddenly, and was succeeded by the Mississippian culture, which constructed the great mound complexes still standing when European explorers arrived in the 16th century. The largest of these, Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was at its peak around the year 1100 CE. It was the largest city north of Mexico, with a population that some estimates place as high as 20,000 people, larger than contemporary London. Cahokia possessed a central platform mound, Monk's Mound, covering 14 acres and rising to a height of 100 feet. It is larger by volume than the Great Pyramid at Giza. It was constructed in stages over several centuries, each stage planned and executed by a population that clearly possessed sophisticated knowledge of engineering, logistics, and astronomy. Cahokia also had, in its central district, a large circle of wooden posts that archaeologists have designated Woodhenge, analogous to Stonehenge in its apparent function as an astronomical calendar. The posts were arranged to mark the solstice and equinox sunrises from a central observation point. The alignment is precise and clearly deliberate. The parallel with Stonehenge is interesting because the parallel is structural, not incidental. Both Stonehenge and Cahokia's Woodhenge employ the same basic principle: a circle of upright markers used to define the position of the astronomical horizon and to mark specific solar events with precision. At Stonehenge, the markers are stone and permanent. At Cahokia, the markers were wood and have been reconstructed from the post holes they left in the ground. Different materials, different cultures, same idea. Is this parallel evidence of contact? Almost certainly not direct evidence. The idea of employing a circle of upright objects to mark the astronomical horizon is a relatively natural one for people paying close attention to the sky and having a reason to mark celestial events. It could be independent invention, but it sits alongside everything else: the stone chambers, the inscriptions, the genetic anomalies, the artistic parallels, as one more data point in a picture that is collectively more than the sum of its parts. Let me tell you about something that occurred underwater. In 1987, a Japanese diver named Kihachiro Aratake was searching for hammerhead sharks near the island of Yonaguni, the southernmost of the Ryukyu Islands that form an arc between Japan and Taiwan. What he discovered instead was a massive underwater structure on the seafloor. The structure, which became known as the Yonaguni Monument, consists of a series of large, flat-topped terraces and platforms of rock arranged in a configuration that many observers have compared to a stepped pyramid. The terraces are regular. The corners are sharp. The surfaces are flat. There are what appear to be carved channels, trenches, and staircases. The mainstream geological interpretation is that the Yonaguni Monument is a natural formation, the result of the way the rock of the region fractures along parallel joints. This interpretation is supported by some Japanese geologists and disputed by others. The debate has not been resolved. What makes this relevant to the American story is not the structure itself, but what it suggests about what else might be submerged. Sea levels at the end of the last ice age were, as mentioned earlier, roughly 400 feet lower than they are today. The coastlines of the world were very different. Vast stretches of continental shelf that are now underwater were once dry land. Some of that land was inhabited. Some of those inhabited areas may have contained settlements and monuments. Off the coast of New England, the continental shelf extends for hundreds of miles before reaching the deep water of the Atlantic. During the last ice age, and for some time afterward, large portions of this shelf were dry land. The area now called Georges Bank, which is today a major fishing ground several hundred miles offshore, was above water roughly 8,000 years ago. People almost certainly lived on what is now the New England continental shelf. Traces of them have been discovered. Scallop fishermen working the shallow Georges Bank grounds have, over the decades, occasionally brought up unusual material in their nets: mammoth teeth, mastodon bones, and, on at least several documented occasions, what appear to be stone tools. These materials have been dated. They are ancient. They are consistent with human occupation of the area before the sea rose. Now, if people were living on the continental shelf 8,000 years ago, and if some of those people or their descendants eventually built stone monuments on the mainland, those monuments might represent a cultural tradition with older roots than we can currently document. Roots that extend back to a time when the landscape of eastern North America was very different, when the ocean was distant, when the climate was different, when the story was being written in ways for which we have no record because the record is submerged. This is speculative, but it is the kind of speculation worth taking seriously because it points towards the existence of a gap in the record that is structural rather than accidental. We cannot observe what lies underwater. We cannot excavate the continental shelf with current technology at any scale that would permit a comprehensive survey. We know that things are there because some have been found by accident, but we do not know what we are missing. The stones that stand above ground in New England may be the visible fraction of a much larger story. A story whose earlier chapters are on the seafloor. I find this image compelling. The idea that the deep history of the Atlantic coast is literally submerged, that the oldest chapters of the human story in this part of the world are underwater, inaccessible to us, makes the surviving stones feel even more precious, even more worthy of study. They are what remains. They may be all that remains of something once much larger, much more complex, much more connected to the wider world than the model allows. Let me now draw together some of the threads I have been following, because I believe a coherent picture is emerging, even if it is necessarily incomplete and necessarily uncertain. What the evidence suggests, considered as a whole, is that the northeastern Atlantic, the body of water stretching from the coast of Iberia to the coast of Newfoundland via the Canaries, the Azores, the British Isles, Iceland, and Greenland, was not an uncrossable barrier in the Bronze Age. People with the technology and the motivation could traverse it. The Norse proved this definitively around 1,000 years ago, but they were probably not the first. The Atlantic megalithic cultures of the European Bronze Age, who were maritime peoples living along coasts, constructing monuments oriented to the sea and the sky, trading across enormous distances within Europe, are the most likely candidates for an earlier crossing. They possessed the tradition of astronomical monument building. They possessed the maritime technology. They possessed, in the North Atlantic coastal route, a path that is challenging but achievable. If they crossed, they arrived in a continent that was already occupied, had been occupied for thousands of years by peoples with their own complex cultures and social structures. They did not arrive in an empty land. Whatever contact occurred, it occurred between different peoples. And the nature of that contact, whether peaceful or violent, whether sustained or episodic, whether it resulted in cultural exchange, absorption, or simple avoidance, is something we can only conjecture. What they may have left behind are the stone chambers of New England, aligned to the same astronomical events that their monuments in Europe marked, constructed with the same building techniques their builders employed in Ireland and Brittany, oriented to the same seasonal turning points that their culture considered sacred. Whether we can ever know this for certain depends on whether the institutional frameworks of American archaeology can relax sufficiently to permit a serious investigation of the question. That, in turn, depends on whether the political and legal landscape surrounding American archaeological investigation can accommodate the possibility that the story is more complicated than the existing model suggests, without that complication being misused, as it has been in the past, to undermine indigenous claims to their history and their land. This is a difficult balance, but it is not an impossible one. The truth about the New England stone chambers, whatever it turns out to be, does not belong to any ideological agenda. It belongs to the full story of human movement and connection across this planet. A story that is richer, stranger, and more interesting than any of the models we have constructed to contain it. We are all descendants of people who crossed distances that should have been uncrossable. We carry in our genes the evidence of migrations that the science of a generation ago asserted could not have occurred. We are discovering in the ground beneath our feet, on the ocean floor beyond our coasts, in the DNA of living people, and in the structure of ancient stones, the evidence of a human past that is deeper, more connected, and more mobile than we were taught to believe. That is not frightening. It is wondrous. The stones of New England are wondrous. Whatever they are, whoever built them, however old they are the work of people who understood the sky, who planned carefully, who built to endure, who cared enough about the turning of the year and the return of the light to mark those moments in stone. That impulse to mark what matters, to construct something that will outlast you, to align yourself with the movements of the heavens, that impulse is human. It is recognizably, unmistakably human, and it is across all the cultural and temporal distance separating us from whoever built these chambers, something we share. The light enters the chamber. It travels down the passage. It strikes the back wall. Someone, 4,000 years ago, or 3,000, or 2,000, stood where you would stand if you were there now, and watched that light, and understood its meaning, and felt whatever the human heart feels when the year turns and the sun begins its return. We do not know their name. We do not know their language. We do not know the full contours of their world. But we know they stood there. The chamber attests to it. The alignment attests to it. The stones attest to it. And that is something, in the great darkness of the pre-Columbian past, in the vast silence of the centuries before writing reached this continent, the stones speak quietly, in the language of orientation, dimension, and construction. But they speak. The question is whether we are willing to listen. The night is long. The forest is quiet. The stones are patient. They have been awaiting this conversation for a very long time. Now, I wish to tell you about something that has been residing at the edge of this story. Something I have been reserving because it requires a particular kind of patience to understand, a particular willingness to hold complexity without resolving it too quickly. There is a tradition among some researchers of ancient American mysteries of examining what is called the linguistic evidence. The comparative study of languages spoken by ancient peoples on both sides of the Atlantic to find traces of contact in the structure and vocabulary of the languages themselves. This is genuinely difficult territory. Linguistics is a rigorous science, and the comparative method used to identify language relationships is well established and demanding. You cannot simply find words that sound alike in two languages and conclude that the languages are related. Sound-alike words occur between unrelated languages constantly, a result of the limited phonetic inventory available to human speech and the law of large numbers. True linguistic relationship requires systematic correspondences in phonology, grammar, and vocabulary that follow predictable patterns of sound change across time. Barry Fell claimed to find linguistic relationships between Celtic and some Native American languages. His claim was dismissed, with some justification, by professional linguists who found his comparative methodology unconvincing. But Fell is not the only researcher to have explored this question. There have been more recent, more rigorous attempts to compare certain features of Eastern Algonquian languages, the language family that includes Abenaki, Mi'kmaq, Lenape, and others, with certain features of ancient Atlantic European languages. The results of these comparisons are, at minimum, suggestive. There are structural features of some Algonquian languages that are unusual within the Native American linguistic landscape and that have analogs in ancient Celtic languages. There are sound correspondences that, while not conclusive on their own, are consistent with very distant relationship or with significant language contact at some point in the past. This is specialist territory, and I want to be honest about the limits of what I can convey with confidence. The linguistic evidence is contested and incomplete. Professional linguists specializing in Native American languages have largely not engaged with these comparisons, either dismissing them without detailed analysis or simply not responding. The researchers conducting the comparisons are again working at the edge of their discipline and with limited institutional support. But the linguistic question is worth asking. Languages are extraordinarily sensitive records of contact. When two peoples meet and interact, their languages reflected in loan words, grammatical borrowings, and phonological changes. If Bronze Age people from the Atlantic Celtic world spent time in New England, even for a few centuries, the languages of the people they encountered would likely carry some trace of that contact. Finding that trace, if it exists, would require a level of interdisciplinary cooperation, bringing professional linguists together with archaeologists, geneticists, and historians in a focused investigation of the question that has not yet occurred. It is another item on the list of investigations that merit attention but have not received it. Let me take you to one more place before this story reaches its natural resting point. One more site, one more piece of evidence, one more stone in the mosaic. There is a site in the hills of western Massachusetts that local historians have been aware of for generations. It is not famous. It does not appear in any official archaeological survey. It has never been the subject of professional excavation. It resides on private land, and the family that owns the land has, for the past several decades, quietly permitted trusted researchers to visit and examine it without publicity or interference. The site consists of a cluster of stone structures on a hillside, 3 chambers of varying size, a series of standing stones, and a flat outcropping of bedrock displaying what appear to be incised marks. The chambers are well-constructed, dry-laid, corbelled, and oriented towards the northeast. The standing stones are arranged in a pattern that, when surveyed, reveals multiple astronomical alignments. What distinguishes this site, what makes it the thing I have saved for later in this narrative, is what sits at the center of the standing stone arrangement. At the center of the arrangement, directly on the flat bedrock, there is a carved basin. Not a large basin, perhaps 18 inches in diameter and 4 inches deep. It has been cut into the bedrock by a tool harder than the bedrock, patiently applied. The basin is circular. Its sides are smooth. Its floor is flat. And on the interior of the basin, at the bottom, there is a carved symbol, a circle with a cross inside it. The ancient solar symbol that appears in rock art from the Iberian Peninsula to Ireland to Scandinavia. The symbol that, in various ancient cultures, represents the sun, the wheel, the cycle of the year. The solar circle is one of the oldest symbols in the human artistic record. It appears in Paleolithic cave art in Europe. It is one of the earliest symbols employed by proto-writing systems in the ancient Middle East. It is carved on the stones of megalithic monuments across Atlantic Europe. It is also found in rock art across North America, including in the Southwest and in the eastern woodlands. Its presence in a carved basin at the center of a standing stone arrangement that is astronomically aligned, at a site that has never been officially excavated or documented by mainstream archaeology, is either another piece of the pattern or an extraordinary coincidence. I have been contemplating this image for several years now. The basin cut into the Massachusetts bedrock, the solar circle at the bottom, the standing stones around it catching the light at the turning of the year. I cannot tell you with certainty what it is. I can tell you that it is there. Those who have seen it, photographed it, and surveyed the surrounding site find it remarkable and find the conventional dismissals inadequate. I can tell you that it deserves to be excavated, documented, dated, and studied by people with a full range of relevant expertise. I can tell you that it has not been, and that this constitutes a failure, a genuine failure of the institution of American archaeology to fulfill its purpose. And I can tell you that the stones, the basin, the symbol at its center, the chambers on the hillside, the standing stones catching the light, will be there when someone finally decides to take them seriously. They are patient. They have been patient for a very long time. There's a way of thinking about history that treats it as a completed entity, a record of events that occurred, were observed, were written down, and can now be known. In this view, the unknown parts of history are simply gaps, and the gaps will be filled in eventually. But the framework organizing the known parts is fundamentally correct, fundamentally stable, fundamentally trustworthy. And then there is another way of thinking about history that treats it as a partially recovered record of events, most of which were not observed or written down, most of which left fragmentary traces in the physical world, that we are still learning to interpret. In this view, the gaps are not just gaps. They are evidence of something. They are the shape of what we have not yet discovered. And what we have not yet discovered may transform the framework. Not because the framework is worthless, but because it was constructed from incomplete evidence, and the new evidence may not conform. The story of pre-Columbian North America belongs in the second category. The framework, the Clovis first model and its descendant theories, is built from real evidence and represents genuine knowledge, but it is also built from incomplete evidence. And the evidence we have been examining tonight strongly suggests that it is incomplete in ways that matter. The stones of New England matter. The inscriptions matter. The genetics matter. The astronomical alignments matter. Not because they prove a specific narrative of ancient contact, but because they constitute evidence that the current narrative is missing something. That there is more to the story than the story currently tells. Discovering what is missing requires investigation. It requires the kind of open-minded, rigorous, multidisciplinary investigation that good science demands. It requires setting aside the institutional inertia that has kept these questions at the margins of American archaeology for the past century. It requires honesty about the distinction between what we know and what we assume, between what the evidence indicates and what the model requires. The stones are extending that invitation. The question is whether we will accept it. When I reflect upon the people who constructed these chambers, whoever they were, I am struck by what they chose to mark and celebrate. They did not build temples to kings, or monuments to military victories, or administrative centers for the management of an empire. They built chambers that captured the solstice light. They aligned standing stones to the cross-quarter days. They mark the turning of the year, the moment when the darkness is longest and the sun begins its return. They were celebrating survival, the continuation of life, the promise of spring. That celebration transcends culture and transcends time. It is the celebration of the Wampanoag people who held ceremonies at the winter solstice. It is the celebration of the Celtic peoples whose festivals of Samhain and Imbolc marked the same seasonal turning points. It is the celebration that, in transformed and attenuated form, we carry forward in our own holidays, Christmas, Hanukkah, and the New Year, all clustered at the darkest time of the year, all expressing the same ancient human relief that the light is returning. Whatever the specific cultural tradition of the chamber builders, they were doing something recognizably human. They were paying attention to the sky. They were marking what mattered. They were building something to endure, and it has endured. That is the final remarkable thing about the New England stone chambers. They have endured through centuries of colonial agriculture, development, and the general indifference of a civilization that did not know what to make of them. They have lasted. The stones are still fitted. The corbelled ceilings still hold. The entrances still face the correct direction. The chambers still capture the solstice light. Whatever the builders intended, whatever ceremony, purpose, or knowledge those chambers were built to serve, they built for the ages, and the ages have preserved them. The forest has grown around them. The hillsides have changed. The world that built them is entirely gone, remembered in no document, known to no one with certainty. And yet the chambers remain, patient and precise and aligned to the sun, awaiting the moment when someone will finally ask the right questions and refuse the easy answers. I hope that moment is approaching. I believe it is. The evidence is accumulating slowly at the edges of the institution, in the work of researchers who have spent their careers outside the mainstream because the mainstream had no room for what they were discovering. In the genetic databases revealing a more complex picture of ancient American populations with each passing year. In the astronomical surveys documenting alignments too precise to be coincidental. in the ground-penetrating radar surveys identifying structures beneath the structures that are already visible. The evidence is accumulating, and eventually it will accumulate to a point where the institution cannot continue to disregard it without making a spectacle of its own rigidity. That is how paradigms shift. Not easily, not quickly, not without resistance, but inexorably. The stones of New England have been part of this landscape for a very long time. They will remain part of it for longer still. And someday, perhaps in our lifetimes, perhaps in the lifetimes of those who come after us, someone will stand in one of those chambers on a winter solstice morning, watching the light travel down the passage and strike the back wall in its brief rectangle of gold. And they will know, not wonder, not suspect, but know who placed that stone in that hillside and why. Until then, the chambers wait, the stones are patient. The light returns each year to the precise spot it has been returning to for thousands of years. And the story is not concluded. It has barely commenced. You have been listening to a lengthy journey through the evidence, the mysteries, and the silences of American prehistory. If you have reached this point, lying in the darkness somewhere on this planet, your breath slowing, the sounds of your world fading into the background, then you have been a companion on this journey. And I am grateful for that. The questions we have been exploring this evening are not small questions. They are questions about who we are, where we came from, how connected the ancient human world was, how much we do not know, how much we may never know. They are questions that the stones themselves raise, resting on their hillsides in the Vermont forests, aligned to the winter sky. I think about those stones often. I think about what it would have been like to be there when they were being constructed, to carry those granite slabs, to fit them in a place, to calculate the angle of the entrance passage so that the solstice light would enter correctly, to step back when it was done and know that you had created something that would endure. It endured. The light still arrives, and somewhere under the accumulated soil of centuries, beneath the trees, the leaves, and the quiet of the New England winter, the rest of the story remains, waiting to be discovered. You can drift towards sleep with that thought. The rest of the story remains, waiting, patient as stone. If this journey helped carry you into the night, if these questions found a comfortable home in the space between waking and sleeping, you might consider subscribing so these late-night explorations can continue. Leave a comment if you feel moved to. Tell me where in the world you are listening from, what time it is where you are, what the night looks like outside your window. Those small connections across geography and time zones feel meaningful to me in a way that is difficult to explain, yet very real. The stars that watched over the builders of those stone chambers are the same stars above you tonight, shifted slightly by the slow wobble of the Earth's axis over the millennia, but recognizably the same. The Pleiades, Orion, and the long, cold band of the Milky Way. They have been observing this story unfold for a very long time. They will continue to watch it unfold. Rest now. The questions will be there in the morning, patient and interesting and worth returning to. The stones will still be on their hillsides. The solstice will still arrive, and the light will still enter the chamber year after year, faithful as it has always been, marking the turning that ancient hands aligned it to mark, speaking in the only language that has endured through every change, every loss, and every silence. The language of stone, light, and time. Good night. There is something I did not share earlier in this story, something I have been considering how to approach because it resides at the intersection of the scientific and the experiential in a way that is difficult to navigate without sounding either credulous or dismissive. People who spend time at the New England stone chamber sites report experiences they find difficult to explain. Not supernatural experiences, not visions, voices, or dramatic apparitions of ghost story tradition, but something quieter and harder to name. A quality of attention that the sites seem to demand, a sense of being in a place organized around a principle that your body understands even when your mind does not. A geologist who spent 3 seasons surveying the sites wrote in her field notes, which she shared with a colleague who shared them with me, that she had spent 20 years doing field work in some of the most dramatic geological settings on the planet: the Grand Canyon walls, the volcanic coast of Iceland, and the glacially carved fjords of Norway, and that none of those places had produced in her what the New England chamber sites produced: a sustained, quiet conviction that the place was made, that every stone was placed, that nothing in the arrangement was accidental. She was writing as a scientist. She was noting a perceptual experience she could not fully explain in purely physical terms. The chambers produced in her a response appropriate to design spaces, to spaces organized by intention, knowledge, and purpose, rather than to natural formations. This is worth taking seriously, not as evidence of the supernatural, but as evidence about the chambers themselves. Design spaces evoke a different response in human perception than natural formations. We are exceptionally adept at detecting design, at recognizing the distinction between the random and the organized. When someone who has spent decades in natural landscapes asserts that a particular site feels designed, that perception should be taken seriously as data about the site. The chambers feel designed because they are designed. Their alignments are intentional. Their proportions are calculated. Their construction demands knowledge and planning that cannot be attributed to accident or to the casual labor of a colonial farmer clearing a field. The experiential testimony of visitors to these sites is consistent across backgrounds, expectations, and prior knowledge. The chambers alter human attention. They organize it. They focus it. They create a quality of presence different from what you experience in the surrounding forest or on an unstructured rock outcropping. That is what design does. That is its purpose. Whatever the full story of these chambers ultimately reveals, whatever the genetic analysis, linguistic comparisons, and archaeological excavations eventually disclose, the chambers themselves are already conveying something simply by being what they are. They are conveying that someone, somewhere in a time we cannot precisely name, thought carefully about this hillside, this orientation, this construction method, and this purpose, and built something to embody that thought. That act of careful thought, embodied in stone, is accessible to us today. We can stand within that thought. We can let the solstice light enter it. We can feel its precision, its intention, its human presence. That is remarkable. That is worth celebrating, regardless of what the genealogical and cultural details ultimately prove to be. Now, let me address the coastline, because one of the elements often lost in the debate about the stone chambers, the inscriptions, and the possible Bronze Age contact is the geography. The geography of the North Atlantic in the Bronze Age was different from today in ways significant to the question of contact. I mentioned earlier that sea levels at the end of the last ice age were roughly 400 feet lower than present. This is important because it means that the coastline of New England, the coastline any Atlantic voyager would have been approaching, looked very different. The continental shelf, which today slopes gently from the coast to deep water beginning perhaps 100 miles offshore, was, in the early Bronze Age, largely above water. The beaches and harbors that would have welcomed arriving voyagers were not where today's coastlines are, but far out on what is now the continental shelf. What this means practically is that the archaeological evidence of any initial contact, any harboring of boats and establishing of camps on the exposed continental shelf, is now submerged. The first traces of Bronze Age European presence in North America, if they exist, are inaccessible with current technology. What has survived, what we can access, are the things built or done in the interior, on the hills and in the valleys above the old coastline. The stone chambers are on high ground. They are situated on hillsides and hilltops. They are in positions that would have been visible from the now submerged coastline, positions that would have served as landmarks for people approaching by sea. When you examine the distribution of New England stone chamber sites on a map with this in mind, something interesting emerges. The sites cluster along river valleys and in upland positions that would have been logical stopping points for people moving inland from the coast. They are spaced in ways that suggest a network, a series of known locations connected by routes that a knowledgeable traveler could follow. This is a speculative interpretation of the distribution data. The same distribution could have other explanations, but it is consistent with what you would expect if the chambers were built by people who arrived by sea and established a series of inland sites for purposes we can only conjecture. Trade, ceremony, seasonal habitation, some combination of these. The geography fits the hypothesis, and when the geography fits, it strengthens the hypothesis, not conclusively, but meaningfully. There is another geographical observation I wish to make, one rarely discussed in the literature on the New England chambers, but which seems to me important. The latitude of New England, between roughly 41 and 45 degrees north, is almost exactly the same latitude as the core regions of Atlantic megalithic Europe. Britain lies between roughly 50 and 58 degrees north. Brittany around 47 to 48 degrees. Iberia from roughly 36 to 44 degrees. The overlap is significant for a specific reason. The astronomical phenomena that the chamber builders were aligning their monuments to are latitude dependent. The angle of the sunrise and sunset at the solstices, the positions on the horizon where the sun rises and sets on the longest and shortest days, vary with latitude. At 51 degrees north, the latitude of Stonehenge, the summer solstice sunrise occurs at a different compass bearing than it does at 43 degrees north, the latitude of central Vermont. If you build a monument in Brittany aligned to the summer solstice sunrise, and then transported that monument design to New England, the alignment would not work. You would have to recalculate the orientation for the new latitude. The New England chambers are correctly oriented for their actual latitudes. They are not copies of European monuments. They are correctly aligned monuments constructed at a different latitude, which means the people who built them knew how to adapt their astronomical knowledge to a new location. They understood the latitude dependence of the solar alignments. They either knew the latitude of New England, or they observed the horizon carefully over multiple years before building, and let their observations guide the orientation. Either of these possibilities implies a level of astronomical sophistication not consistent with the simple picture of Bronze Age people who stumbled onto this continent by accident and built a few stone structures before sailing home. It implies people who arrived with knowledge, who arrived with intention, who knew what they were doing and possessed the technical capacity to do it correctly in a new environment. That is not a conclusion to take lightly, but it is a conclusion that the orientation data, properly analyzed, seems to support. Let me sit with you in the silence of this for a moment, because there is much to hold here. The alignments, the construction techniques, the inscriptions, the genetics, the geography, the oral traditions, the colonial descriptions. All of these pieces of evidence, examined individually and in combination, paint a picture that is, at minimum, deeply anomalous within the framework of the accepted model. The accepted model asserts that pre-Columbian North America was isolated from the Old World, that no significant contact occurred, that the stone chambers are root cellars or Native American structures of uncertain purpose, that the inscriptions are natural marks or wishful misreadings, that the genetic anomalies are the result of drift, that the astronomical alignments are coincidences. The evidence suggests that the chambers are astronomically aligned in ways that are not accidental and that share structural characteristics with European megalithic monuments. The inscriptions at some sites display structural properties inconsistent with random mark-making. The genetic data includes anomalies difficult to explain without some form of contact. The maritime technology of Bronze Age Atlantic Europe was sufficient to make the crossing. The geography of the North Atlantic provides a navigable route. These are two different stories. One conforms to the existing model. One conforms to the evidence. This does not imply that the existing model is worthless. It implies that the existing model is incomplete. And the direction in which it is incomplete is the direction of the evidence. Towards more contact, more complexity, more connection between the ancient American and the ancient Old World. I am not in a position to tell you what occurred. I am not in a position to provide a definitive answer about who built the New England stone chambers, or when, or why. The evidence does not yet support definitive answers. What it supports is a serious investigation that has not yet occurred. But I want you to feel, as you lie in the dark listening to this, the weight and the wonder of the question, because the question is genuinely wonderful. It is asking whether the human story of this continent is connected to the wider human story of the Atlantic world in ways we have not yet recognized. It is asking whether the people who built Newgrange in Ireland, Carnac in Brittany, and the chambers of Orkney were part of a wider world that extended, at some point, to the hillsides of Vermont and New Hampshire. If the answer is affirmative, then the human story is larger than we thought, more connected, more mobile, more adventurous. The oceans were crossed before we said they were crossed. The Americas were part of the wider world before Columbus made them officially part of it. If the answer is negative, then we have a collection of genuinely extraordinary coincidences to explain, and the explanation will be interesting in its own right. Either way, the investigation is worth pursuing. Let us now turn to a specific kind of evidence I have not yet discussed. Evidence that resides not in stones, genes, or inscriptions, but in plants. Plants are remarkable recorders of human movement. They travel with us. They are carried in cargo, in clothing, in the soil on boots, and in the digestive tracts of animals. When humans move, plants move with them, sometimes accidentally, sometimes intentionally. The distribution of cultivated and useful plants around the world is, in many cases, a map of human migration and contact. The distribution of certain plants in pre-Columbian North America has been the subject of ongoing debate among botanists and archaeologists for decades. Several plants that appear in the archaeological and historical record of North America prior to European contact have origins in, or connections to, the Old World that are difficult to explain without some form of pre-Columbian contact. The most discussed of these is the coconut, found in archaeological contexts on the coasts of the Americas prior to European contact, and whose distribution pattern suggests human transport rather than natural drift alone. But there are others, less famous and perhaps more telling. There are a handful of plant species that appear in both Atlantic European archaeological contexts and in pre-Columbian northeastern North American contexts, possessing nutritional or medicinal properties that would have made them valuable trade items, and lacking obvious mechanisms for natural dispersal across the Atlantic. I am being deliberately vague about specific species here, because the botanical evidence in this area is genuinely contested, and I do not wish to overstate the confidence level of the claims. What I can say is that there are botanical researchers who have examined this question carefully, and who believe the plant distribution data is consistent with, though not proof of, transatlantic contact in the Bronze Age period. What makes the botanical evidence interesting is its independence from the other lines of evidence. The stones, the genetics, and the inscriptions are all potentially vulnerable to the objection that they have been interpreted through a lens of prior expectation, that people who believe in pre-Columbian contact tend to perceive the evidence they are seeking. This is a fair methodological concern, even if it does not fully account for all the evidence. But botanists studying plant distribution patterns typically do not have a prior commitment to any particular model of pre-Columbian contact. They are examining distribution data and asking the simplest question: how did this plant get here? When the simplest answer to that question is human transport, the implication is contact. The botanical evidence is thin. I want to be honest about that. It is suggestive rather than conclusive. But it is another line of evidence, another data point in a picture with many data points and a consistent pattern. Now let me tell you about a researcher who approached this entire question from a direction no one else had thought to try. His name is not important, and he is still active and would prefer not to be identified. But the approach he took is worth describing. He was trained as a geologist, and he brought to the question of the New England chambers the methodological habits of his discipline, specifically the use of weathering analysis to estimate the age of exposed rock surfaces. Rock weathers. It weathers at rates affected by climate, mineralogy, and exposure conditions, but for a given rock type in a given climate, the rate is reasonably consistent. If you know the weathering rate of a particular kind of stone in a particular environment, you can estimate from the degree of weathering on a rock surface how long that surface has been exposed. This is not a new technique. It is used in geology routinely to estimate the age of landslides, glacial deposits, and other geological features. It is not archaeology, and its application to archaeological contexts is methodologically complex, requiring careful control for the many variables affecting weathering rates. But it is a real technique with real evidentiary value when applied carefully. This geologist spent several years taking samples from the interior surfaces of New England chambers and from the exterior surfaces of standing stones associated with those chambers, and analyzing them for weathering characteristics, comparing the results with known weathering rates for the same rock types in the same regional climate. His conclusions, shared in a limited way with the research community, but never formally published because he did not wish to expose himself to the professional costs of association with this field, were that several of the sites he studied displayed weathering characteristics consistent with ages of 2,000 to 4,000 years. The range was wide because of the inherent uncertainty in the method and the variability in exposure conditions, but the lower end of the range was well beyond the colonial period, and the upper end was in the Bronze Age. He was careful in describing his conclusions. He stated that the weathering data was consistent with the hypothesis that the chambers were built 2,000 to 4,000 years ago. He did not assert that the weathering data proved this. He said it was not inconsistent with it. That kind of careful, qualified statement is exactly what rigorous science looks like. The conclusion is appropriately hedged. The method is acknowledged to have limitations. The evidence is presented as consistent with a hypothesis rather than as proof of it. And because the hypothesis is the pre-Columbian construction of the chambers, the careful and qualified evidence has received the same reception as the less careful and less qualified evidence. No response. The pattern holds. Let me now relate the oldest documented record of one of these sites. In the journals of a Massachusetts Bay Colony official from the 1640s, there is a brief but interesting entry describing a visit to a hill near the town of Salem, New Hampshire, where the official notes, "There are curious stone structures of great age that the local natives say were built by a people who came before them." The entry is brief, and the official clearly does not know what to make of what he saw. He describes the structures as resembling, in some respects, the ancient monuments of the old country, by which he presumably means the stone chambers and standing stones of Britain, which were known to educated Englishmen of his era as ancient features of their landscape. This comparison, made in the 1640s by a man who had no reason to fabricate it, and every reason to dismiss the structures as native curiosities, if that were the obvious explanation, is interesting for several reasons. First, it establishes that the sites were already of apparent great age in the 17th century, old enough that the colonial official noted this explicitly. Second, it confirms that local Native Americans were already attributing the structures to a pre-existing people. Third, and perhaps most significantly, it records the impression of a 17th century Englishman with direct knowledge of the stone monuments of Britain that these New England structures were similar to those monuments. This is not scientific evidence. It is a historical document, a personal observation made by one person about his subjective experience of a site. But it is contemporaneous documentation made within 2 decades of European settlement of the area. And it describes a state of affairs consistent with the hypothesis. Old structures, locally attributed to a people who came before, appearing to a knowledgeable European observer to resemble the ancient stone monuments of Atlantic Europe. The document isn't a historical archive. It has been seen by researchers interested in the New England chambers. It has not been cited in mainstream archaeological literature because mainstream archaeological literature on the New England chambers is essentially non-existent. There are more such documents. The historical record of colonial New England is quite extensive, and it contains a number of such references, brief, incidental, not the focus of the document in which they appear, but noting the presence of stone structures that the settlers found curious and old, and not clearly attributable to the Native American populations they knew. These references have been collected by NERA researchers and published in the organization's journal. They have not been collected or analyzed by mainstream archaeologists. The documents do not prove anything by themselves, but they establish as a historical fact that the stone chambers were already a recognized feature of the New England landscape in the earliest period of European settlement, that they were regarded as ancient by the Native Americans who knew them, and that they were noted as unusual and reminiscent of Old World monuments by European settlers who had no agenda beyond describing what they observed. That historical baseline is worth having. It anchors the question in documented fact rather than speculation. I want to shift now to discussing what is actually happening in the current research landscape, because the story is not static. Things are changing slowly in ways that are both encouraging and frustrating in different measures. The last decade has seen a significant expansion of the genetic evidence relevant to pre-Columbian contact. The revolution in ancient DNA extraction and analysis has made it possible to read the genetic histories of ancient populations with a precision inconceivable 20 years ago. Researchers have sequenced the genomes of ancient humans from across the Americas and from across Europe, Asia, and Africa. And the picture of ancient human movement emerging from this work is dramatically more complex than the simple story the Clovis first model requires. Ancient DNA research has confirmed that the Americas were colonized from Northeast Asia. It has confirmed that there were multiple waves of migration, not a single founding population. It has revealed that the ancient populations of the Americas were more diverse than their modern descendants, a sign of population processes that included extinction, replacement, and mixing over long periods. It has also revealed anomalies. Genetic signals in ancient South American populations pointing towards Australasia, not Asia. Evidence of population movements within the Americas that were more dynamic and long-range than anyone expected. And in the ancient DNA of northeastern North American populations, the persistent signal of haplogroup X2A, the mitochondrial lineage whose closest relatives outside the Americas are found in the populations of the Middle East and Europe. The ancient DNA research has not proven pre-Columbian Atlantic contact, but it has consistently revealed that the ancient Americas were more complex, more connected, and more surprising than the previous model required. And each time the ancient DNA reveals something unexpected, the evidence for a more complex picture accumulates, and the threshold for taking the hypothesis of Atlantic contact seriously drops a little lower. The archaeoastronomy research is also accumulating. More sites are being surveyed with professional equipment. More alignments are being documented. The statistical database of New England chamber orientations is growing. And the growing database is making it harder to dismiss the alignments as coincidences that a researcher who surveys 60 sites and finds statistically significant astronomical alignments at 50 of them is not describing a coincidence. She is describing a pattern, and patterns require explanation. The ground-penetrating radar surveys are revealing hidden complexity at sites that appeared simple on the surface. The subsurface features identified at the Salem site and elsewhere have not been excavated, but their existence is documented, and the documentation is available to anyone who wishes to examine it. And the historical archival research continues quietly in the historical societies, town archives, and library collections of New England, uncovering more incidental references to the stone chambers in the earliest colonial records, building a documentary history that places the sites firmly in the colonial landscape while noting their perceived antiquity. All of this research is occurring. It is occurring outside the mainstream, in organizations like NERA, and in the work of individual researchers who have found ways to continue without institutional support. But it is occurring, and it is building a body of evidence more comprehensive and more rigorous than what was available a generation ago. The mainstream has not responded. The mainstream journals have not published the research. The mainstream conferences have not included it in their programs. The mainstream archaeologists have not written the rebuttals that would at least acknowledge the evidence by engaging with it. The silence continues. But the evidence does not care about the silence. It accumulates, and eventually, paradigms shift. There is a researcher in her 30s, recently finished with a doctorate in archaeoastronomy, from a European institution, who has begun quietly and carefully to include the New England Chamber sites in her comparative work on Bronze Age astronomical monuments in the Atlantic world. She is being careful. She is framing the New England sites as anomalies that require explanation rather than as evidence of any specific theory. She is building a case, stone by stone, in the academic sense, designed to survive the scrutiny that will come when she eventually publishes. She knows that the scrutiny will be intense. She knows that the institutional resistance to her conclusions will be proportional to how threatening those conclusions are to the existing model. She is preparing for that resistance by making her evidence as rigorous as possible and her claims as carefully bounded as possible. She told me, in a conversation I wish to share with you, that the thing that sustains her is not any particular theory about who built the chambers or when. It is the chambers themselves. She said that every time she stands in one, on any day, at any time of year, she feels the same thing. That these places were created with intention and knowledge, and that the intention and knowledge deserve to be understood. That not understanding them is a failure of scholarship she takes personally. I find that a very human and very admirable statement. It is the statement of a scientist motivated by genuine curiosity, rather than by the desire to confirm a prior belief. She does not know what the chambers are. She wants to discover. She is doing the work that might eventually allow her to discover. That work is what science is meant to be. I hope she completes it. I hope she publishes it. I hope the institutions that have maintained the silence respond with engagement rather than dismissal. I hope that the generation of archaeologists who follow the current one find a field more open to the full range of evidence and more willing to follow that evidence wherever it leads. I believe that is happening slowly, with the usual friction of institutional change, but happening. The stones will be there when it happens. They will not have moved. Let me recount one more story before I bring this to a close. One more piece of this mosaic that sits in the corner and catches the light in a way I keep returning to. In the town of Mystery Hill, which is the tourist name for the Salem, New Hampshire site housing what is called America's Stonehenge, there is a particular chamber that has been studied more carefully than almost any other at the site. It is not the largest chamber. It is not the most dramatically aligned. It is a medium-sized space with a corbelled ceiling and an entrance passage oriented to the southwest. What makes this chamber interesting is what is at the back of it. At the back wall of the chamber, set into the construction at a height of about 4 feet from the floor, is a single stone different from the others. It is not different in material. It is the same local granite as the rest of the construction, but it is different in surface treatment. Its interior face, the face that would be seen by someone standing in the chamber, is smooth. Not roughly smooth in the way stone becomes smooth when it weathers, but precisely smooth, deliberately ground to a flat surface. And on that smooth surface, in light that is low and raking, there are marks. Not clearly legible characters. Not obviously natural marks, but something in between. Marks with a regularity, a directionality, and a depth consistency suggesting they were made deliberately with a tool following some kind of plan. The marks have been photographed many times over the years. The photographs vary in their ability to reveal the marks depending on lighting conditions. And this variation has led to disagreements about whether the marks are truly there or are artifacts of photographic technique. High-resolution photogrammetry, which eliminates dependency on lighting angle, has been employed at the site, and the results confirm that there are physical impressions in the stone surface, regular and directed, not natural weathering or fracture patterns. What the marks signify, if they signify anything, is unknown. They have not been successfully interpreted by anyone with relevant expertise, partly because that expertise, the ability to identify ancient Atlantic scripts, is vanishingly rare, and the small number of people who possess it have not spent significant time with the chamber. The marks remain documented and undeciphered, but the smooth back wall of the chamber, with its undeciphered marks, sits in my mind as a kind of summary of the entire situation. Something was placed there deliberately. Something was intended. Something was communicated, commemorated, or consecrated on that surface, and we cannot read it. Not because the information is absent. It is present. The marks are there, physical, real, preserved in the stone, but the code, the cultural knowledge that would allow us to understand them is gone. It departed with the people who made them, whenever and wherever that was. This is the nature of lost histories. They do not vanish entirely. They leave traces, but the traces require interpretation. And interpretation requires knowledge, and the knowledge is sometimes irretrievably lost. Sometimes it is only mostly lost. Sometimes there is enough still accessible in the archives, the ethnographies, the comparative studies, and the scientific analyses to piece together a partial understanding. The work of piecing together that partial understanding is what the researchers I've been describing are doing. It is slow, difficult, professionally costly, and institutionally opposed. But it is the work that the evidence demands, and some people are doing it. I want to honor that work. I want to state that the researchers who have spent decades studying these sites, who have documented, measured, analyzed, and published and been ignored, have been doing something important. They have been maintaining the possibility of understanding, keeping alive the thread of inquiry that might eventually lead to answers. The answers are not here yet, but the possibility of them is preserved in the archives, the papers, the field notes, and the collections, awaiting the moment when the institutional resistance to the question finally exhausts itself, and someone with the full resources of mainstream archaeology brings those resources to bear on what is actually there. Until that moment, the chambers wait, as they have always waited. The light enters them at the right time. The stones hold their alignment. The marks on the back wall of the chamber at America's Stonehenge continue to convey whatever they convey in a language we have not yet recovered. The night is long, the forest is quiet, the stones are patient. And the story, the full and real and complex story of human presence on this continent before the age of recorded history, before Columbus, before the Norse, before any of the contacts we currently acknowledge. That story is still out there, embedded in the landscape, encoded in genes and stones, and the orientation of chambers on hillsides that face the sunrise on the longest day. We have not discovered it yet. Not completely. Not in a form the institutions will accept. But we are getting closer, and the stones are waiting for us to arrive. You know, there is something I find deeply moving about this story when I step back and view it as a whole. We are a species that builds. We build things with our hands, things that outlast us, things that carry something of us forward into times we will not live to see. The stone chambers of New England are the most durable evidence we have of whatever people built them. Everything else about those people, their language, their beliefs, their social structures, their songs and stories and relationships and laughter and grief, all of that is gone, completely gone. What remains is the way they place stone upon stone. And the way they place stone upon stone is so deliberate, so informed, so precisely calibrated to the movements of the sun, that it tells us something important about who they were. They were people who paid attention. They were people who cared about the sky, about time, about the turning of the year. They were people who thought about permanence, who built for the long view, who understood that the solstice would come next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, and who wanted their buildings to be there for all of those solstices. They achieved their goal. The buildings are there. Whether they were Bronze Age sailors from Atlantic Europe, or an unknown pre-Columbian American culture, or something else entirely, they were people who built for the ages, and the ages have preserved their buildings. That is an active connection across time. Whoever built these chambers was reaching forward through the darkness of all the centuries they could not see, and offering something to the people who came after them. An alignment, a structure, a place where the light would come at the turning of the year. We are the people who came after them. The light is still arriving. All we have to do is be there to receive it, and to ask honestly and carefully who lit the way. There are nights when I think about the builders of the New England chambers the way I think about certain composers or writers whose names are forgotten, but whose work survives. The music is still there, or the story, or in this case, the stone alignment, and the person who made it is utterly gone, leaving only the made thing, the intention crystallized into matter. There is a humility and a dignity in that situation. You cannot know if anyone will understand what you have made. You cannot know if anyone will even recognize it as made rather than natural. You build anyway. You align the entrance to the sunrise anyway. You fit the stones with the care they deserve anyway, because the act of making it, of caring enough to do it right, is itself the thing. The understanding of it by future people, that is a gift you cannot count on. You make it, and you release it. The builders of these chambers made something, and released it. Whatever their intentions, whatever the ceremonies they conducted, and the knowledge they embedded in the orientations and proportions of what they built, they released all of that into the future, into us. And we are standing at the threshold of understanding what they made. Not all the way there, but closer than we were a generation ago. That feels like something. The history of discovery is full of moments when something very old and very important finally received the attention it deserved, when the right person with the right tools and the right open mind stood before something that had been overlooked or dismissed and saw it clearly for what it was. That moment for the New England stone chambers has not yet arrived. But it will. These stones are not going anywhere. They are more patient than the institution that ignores them. They are more patient than the careers built on the existing model. They are more patient than the political and legal frameworks that have made this kind of investigation difficult. They are as patient as stone, which is to say, enormously, cosmically patient. They will wait for the archaeologist who arrives with the right tools, the right questions, and the right absence of prior assumptions, and stands in one of these chambers on a solstice morning, watches the light, and says clearly, and in print, and in a peer-reviewed journal, with enough professional courage to support the claim: this was made. I can prove it was made, and when I prove it was made, I will follow that proof wherever it leads. That person is out there somewhere. Perhaps she is the young researcher I mentioned. Perhaps she is someone who has not yet completed her education. Someone who will be shaped by a field that is slowly, grudgingly opening to the possibility that the story is more complex than it appeared. I hope she arrives soon. The chambers are ready for her. The light is ready. The stones are patient. And the story of who built them, and when, and from where, and why, is one of the most interesting and most important unanswered questions in American history. Not just American history, but human history. Because if the story of these chambers is the story of Bronze Age people crossing the North Atlantic to a continent they could not have known existed, to build monuments aligned to the solstice on hills above a coastline now underwater, to leave inscriptions in scripts we are still learning to read, and then to vanish from the historical record, leaving only the stones and the alignments and the ghost of their knowledge in the distribution of a mitochondrial haplogroup in the tribes of the Northeast. then that story is one of the most extraordinary stories in the human record. A story of daring, skill, curiosity, distance, and time. A story of people who looked at an ocean and decided to cross it. A story of the human refusal to accept the horizon as a limit. That story deserves to be told fully and honestly. And I believe it will be. Until it is, the stones speak in the only language available to them. The language of alignment, dimension, and the angle of the midwinter sun entering the passage and striking the back wall in its brief and faithful rectangle of gold. That language has been waiting 4,000 years to be translated. It is still waiting, but not, I think, for much longer. Sleep well tonight. Dream of cold hillsides in Vermont and the smell of ancient stone and the way the light appears when it first crests the hill on the shortest day of the year and enters the chamber someone built to receive it. Dream of the builders who made that chamber, who chose that hill, who measured that angle, who fitted those stones with a precision that centuries of frost, rain, and snow have not disturbed. They were human like you. They gazed at the sky the way you gaze at the sky. They wondered about the things we wonder about. They wanted to mark what mattered and build something to endure. They succeeded. The chambers are still there. The light still arrives. And somewhere in the hills of New England, in a forest that has grown up around stones that were old when the forest was young, the solstice morning is waiting, faithful as it has always been, ready to do what it has done every year. For as long as the sun has risen over those hills, it will rise, and the light will enter the chamber, and the chamber will hold it for those 20 minutes of gold. And no one alive knows who built it that way, but someone is going to find out. That is enough to carry you into sleep. Good night. But since you are still here, since sleep has not yet claimed you, let me continue speaking. Let me take you deeper into this story, into some of its stranger corners and more specific details, because the details matter. The details are where truth resides. There is a town in Connecticut called Groton, best known today for its submarine base and shipbuilding history. Groton sits at the mouth of the Thames River, where it opens into Long Island Sound, a sheltered and navigable stretch of water that would have been one of the most attractive harbors on the North Atlantic coast for any people arriving by sea. In the hills above Groton, in stretches of forest that have been slowly consumed by suburban development over the past several decades, there are or were a series of stone structures that local historians have been documenting for more than a century. Some of these structures have been destroyed by development. Some have been absorbed into the landscape of colonial-era stone walls and agricultural clearings, and are now indistinguishable from their later surroundings. But some survive on parcels of land that, by luck or intention, have not been built upon. The Groton sites are smaller and less dramatic than the Salem, New Hampshire complex or the Vermont sites. They do not announce themselves with the confidence of the larger chambers. They are modest, careful constructions, a series of small chambers, dolmen-like flat-roof cists, and upright stones arranged in configurations that suggest purpose without declaring it. A historian who spent several years in the 1990s documenting the Groton sites before development eliminated some of them left a detailed record preserved in the local historical society. Her documentation includes measured drawings, photographs, and notes on the orientations of the surviving structures. When her orientation data is analyzed against astronomical tables for the relevant latitude, several of the surviving structures show alignments to the major solar events, the solstices and the equinoxes, at a level of precision that cannot be attributed to accident. Her documentation also includes one observation she found puzzling and noted without explanation. Two of the structures she documented were oriented not to the sun, but to the moon, specifically to the positions on the horizon where the moon rises and sets at its northernmost and southernmost extremes, events known as the major lunar standstills, which occur on an approximately 18.6-year cycle. Lunar standstill orientations are found in several Atlantic megalithic monuments in Europe, most notably at a complex in Scotland called Callanish and at certain monuments in Ireland. They are not found in any known pre-Columbian North American culture. They require sustained observation of the moon over a period of years, because the standstill cycle is nearly 19 years long, and you need to observe multiple positions across that cycle to identify the extreme positions with precision. The researcher who documented the Groton sites did not have a theory about what the lunar orientations meant. She simply noted them and moved on. But the lunar standstill orientation is one of the most specific and least ambiguous markers of the Atlantic megalithic astronomical tradition you can find. It is not something that arises by accident. It requires knowledge of a specific long-period astronomical cycle and the intention to mark it. Finding it in Connecticut, documented in the work of a local historian who had no particular theory about ancient contact to advance, is extraordinary. The documentation exists. It is in the Groton Historical Society. It has not been reviewed by mainstream archaeologists. This is not a unique situation. Across New England, in the historical societies, town archives, and local historical publications of hundreds of towns, there are pieces of this story sitting in folders, boxes, and ledgers, documented by people who did not know what they had, but who were careful enough to record it. The pieces have not been assembled into the comprehensive picture they could form, because the academic institution that would normally do that work has decided, in advance, that the picture cannot be what the pieces suggest. The Groton documentation is one piece. There are many others. In western Massachusetts, there is a town called Shutesbury, a small community in the hill country north of Amherst. Shutesbury is the kind of town that appears on maps but not in most travel guides. A place of forest, farms, and the occasional art studio deep in the Connecticut River watershed. In the forests of Shutesbury, on a ridge above a brook that runs down to the Quabbin Reservoir, there is a standing stone that has been known to local people for generations. The stone is about 8 feet tall and roughly cylindrical, a column of local granite that stands alone on the ridge in a way that is clearly intentional. That cannot be attributed to the random deposit of glacial activity that left so much of New England's rock scattered across the landscape. Standing stones are common enough in the New England landscape that most are dismissed as property markers, geological oddities, or boundary posts from the colonial period. Many of them are exactly that, but some are not. And distinguishing between the colonial property markers and the possible pre-colonial standing stones requires exactly the kind of careful investigation that has generally not been applied to the region's stone monuments. The Shutesbury stone has been surveyed. Its position on the ridge, its height and girth, and the orientation of its long axis have all been measured carefully by a researcher who was not looking for anything in particular, and who found what she found because she measured everything. The stone's long axis is oriented to the winter solstice sunrise. When you stand at the stone and look in the direction its long axis points, you are looking toward the horizon gap where the sun will rise on the shortest day of the year. This is either a coincidence or a deliberate alignment. There are many ways to try to determine which it is, but the most persuasive is the simplest. Does the stone look like a colonial property marker, or does it look like something someone placed carefully in a calculated position? A colonial property marker is typically a rough stone set vertically in the ground with no particular orientation. The Shutesbury stone is 8 feet tall, carefully positioned, and oriented to an astronomical event. It looks less like a property marker and more like a standing stone. In the British and Irish landscape, standing stones of similar height and apparent intention are found throughout the areas of highest Atlantic megalithic monument density. They mark boundaries, routes, and astronomical events. They are part of the network of monuments that includes the chambers, stone circles, and passage tombs. They do not exist in isolation from the other monument types. They are part of a system. If the New England stone chambers represent the passage tomb component of the Atlantic megalithic system, And if the standing stones represent another component, the overall picture begins to look less like a series of isolated anomalies, and more like a partial reflection of the broader monument landscape of Bronze Age Atlantic Europe. That is a significant claim. I am aware of it. I am not making it as a conclusion. I am presenting it as a hypothesis that the evidence supports at a level that warrants serious investigation. The investigation has not occurred, but the hypothesis stands, supported by the evidence available, awaiting the investigation. Let me tell you about a particular moment in the history of this research that I think is important to understand. In 1983, a symposium was held at Harvard University on the subject of pre-Columbian contacts with the Americas. The symposium brought together researchers from archaeology, genetics, linguistics, and related fields to present and discuss the evidence for and against various forms of pre-Columbian contact. The papers presented at that symposium were eventually published in a volume that sat on library shelves for several years before becoming one of the more cited works in the alternative archaeology literature. The volume was not widely reviewed in mainstream journals, but it received enough attention among researchers interested in the question that it became a kind of touchstone for the field. What is significant about the Harvard Symposium is not the specific papers presented, although some are important in their own right. What is significant is that it occurred at all. Harvard University, one of the most prestigious academic institutions in the world, hosted a serious symposium on the evidence for pre-Columbian contact. The participants included credentialed researchers with real expertise. The presentations were serious academic work, not fringe speculation. The symposium did not change the mainstream of American archaeology. The resistance was too deeply embedded, the institutional inertia too strong. But it demonstrated that the question was not inherently unserious, that it could be addressed with real scholarship in an appropriate academic setting. The papers from that symposium are still out there, in libraries, archives, and the hands of researchers who have read them and thought about them. They are part of the accumulated body of work that the eventual mainstream engagement with this question will have to reckon with. And the eventual mainstream engagement will come, perhaps when a particularly dramatic find forces the issue, when something is excavated or analyzed that cannot be explained within the existing framework, even by the most determined effort to explain it. Perhaps when the generational change within the field of American archaeology brings in a cohort of researchers who did not build their careers on the Clovis first model and feel less invested in its defense. Perhaps when the political and legal landscape shifts in ways that make the investigation of these sites less fraught. Perhaps, and this is the more uncomfortable possibility, when the weight of accumulating evidence simply becomes too heavy for institutional denial to sustain. That weight is growing. Every year it grows. The genetic databases expand. The archaeoastronomical surveys add more sites. The historical archives yield more incidental documentation. The ground-penetrating radar finds more subsurface features. The botanical studies add more data points. The weight grows, and the mainstream stays silent. But silence is not refutation. Silence is the last resort of an institution that cannot refute, but has not yet accepted. History suggests that the last resort eventually fails. Now, there is one more thing I want to share with you before this story rests for the night. One more piece of evidence I have been saving because it is the strangest and because it is the most difficult to evaluate, and because it has been sitting in the published record for decades, acknowledged and then ignored in exactly the pattern that characterizes so much of this story. In the 1970s, a researcher conducting a systematic survey of New England historical records found a series of documents that referred to what the colonial writers called the peculiar people, or a tribe apart, or the ancient ones. A group or groups encountered by early settlers in certain inland areas of New England who were described as physically different from the surrounding Native American populations and as speaking a language no interpreter could understand. These references are scattered, brief, and impossible to verify. They appear in private correspondence, in the journals of colonial administrators, and in the records of early missionaries. They are not consistent enough in their details to constitute a clear and coherent account of a specific group. They could reflect genuine encounters with an isolated or unusual population, or they could reflect the projection of European expectations and anxieties onto Native American groups who were unfamiliar, or they could be exaggerations or fabrications. The researcher who found these documents was careful about how he presented them. He described them as intriguing historical anomalies requiring further investigation, rather than as proof of anything. He published his findings in the Nera Journal, where they were noted and discussed without reaching a conclusion. What makes these documents interesting in the context of everything else we have been discussing is their consistency with the hypothesis of a small, isolated population with Old World origins surviving in the northeastern interior into the early contact period. If Bronze Age people reached New England several thousand years ago, and if a small community of them or their descendants survived and became isolated over the subsequent millennia, they might, by the 17th century, have been a very small, genetically distinct group with a language bearing no resemblance to any Native American language, and with physical characteristics that might have appeared unusual to European observers. This is highly speculative. I want to be very clear about that. The colonial documents are ambiguous. The hypothesis they might support is not established by the documents alone, but in the context of the other evidence, the chambers, the genetics, the astronomical alignments, the inscriptions, and the botanical data, the colonial documents add one more layer to a picture that has many layers in a consistent direction. The picture suggests that something occurred in pre-Columbian North America that the current model does not account for. What that something was, and what its full implications are, we do not yet know. But the question is real. The evidence is real. And the investigation deserves to happen. And with that, I will let this story rest. We have traveled a long way tonight. We have walked through the evidence for, around, and behind one of the most contested questions in American archaeology. We have met the researchers who have spent their careers on this question, and the institutions that have ignored them. We have stood in the chambers and felt the precision of their construction and the intention embedded in their orientation. We have looked at the marks on their walls, the standing stones in their landscapes, and the genetic data in our own cells. We have not arrived at a conclusion because the evidence does not yet support a final conclusion. It supports an investigation. It demands an investigation, and the investigation has not occurred. That is the honest state of the question as of tonight. But the question is alive. The evidence is accumulating. The researchers are working, and the stones are patient. They have been patient for 4,000 years. They will be patient a little longer. And someday, perhaps sooner than we think, someone will stand in the beam of solstice light inside one of those Vermont chambers and know, not guess, not hypothesize, but know who built it and when and why. That knowing will transform the story of this continent. Not in the way that bad histories have claimed, not in a way that diminishes or displaces the indigenous peoples whose home this continent has been for thousands of years, but in the way that genuine understanding always changes things. By making the picture larger, more complex, more connected to the wider human story. The Americas are part of the human world. They always have been. The isolation was never complete, and the contact was probably never as rare as the official story requires. The stones of New England are part of the evidence for that. And the story they are telling, in the patient language of stone and alignment and the angle of the winter sun, is one of the most interesting stories in the human record. I will leave you with that. The night is long. The forest is quiet. The chambers are on their hillsides, aligned to the stars. Dream well. The story will be waiting for you in the morning, along with the stones, along with the question, along with the patient accumulation of evidence that is building slowly towards the truth. Good night. Since you are still with me in the darkness, still listening, let me take you a little further. Let me explore some of the territory I touched briefly earlier, and remain there longer, because the territory deserves more than a passing mention. I want to speak to you about the Great Lakes copper. The Great Lakes region of North America contains one of the largest deposits of native copper, pure metallic copper that exists as natural nuggets and sheets in the rock in the world. The copper mines of Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula in what is now Michigan were mined intensively, by some estimates, over a period of several thousand years, beginning roughly 6,000 years ago. The mining was prehistoric, conducted by people who left behind pits, excavation tools, and the remnants of their work in quantities that stagger the imagination. Archaeologists who have studied the mining record estimate that somewhere between 1 and 12 billion pounds of copper were removed from the Lake Superior region over the period of ancient mining. That is an extraordinary quantity. It is far more than the amount of copper found in the archaeological record of North American cultures from the relevant periods. The question of where all that copper has been hanging over Great Lakes archaeology for the better part of a century. The conventional answer is that the copper was used locally, that it was worked into tools and ornaments and traded within North America, and that the disparity between the amount mined and the amount found is the result of recycling, reuse, and the limitations of what has been recovered archaeologically. This answer is plausible, but several researchers have pointed out that it requires copper recycling rates and trade distributions that have no parallel in any other ancient culture's use of copper, and that the sheer scale of the mining, beginning at a time when North American cultures were supposedly small, mobile hunter-gatherer bands, is difficult to reconcile with the idea of entirely local demand. A Bronze Age European researcher named Gunnar Thomsen spent years investigating the possibility that ancient Mediterranean and Northern European cultures obtained Bronze Age copper from the Great Lakes, and that the trade routes connecting the copper source to the bronze-producing cultures of Europe are the mechanism by which pre-Columbian Atlantic contact occurred. His hypothesis is that Bronze Age ships crossed the Atlantic not in search of new lands but in search of copper, one of the two essential ingredients in bronze, along with tin, and that the mining of the Great Lakes region was driven by demand from the bronze-producing cultures of the Old World. This hypothesis is bold, and it has been criticized on multiple grounds. The logistics of shipping copper across the Atlantic in the Bronze Age are challenging, though not impossible given what we know about Bronze Age maritime capacity. The identification of North American copper in Old World Bronze Age objects has been claimed by Thomsen and disputed by other researchers. The connection between the timing of the Great Lakes mining peak and the Bronze Age copper needs in the Mediterranean is suggestive but not conclusive. But the hypothesis has not been formally refuted. It has been dismissed, which is different. Dismissal does not require engaging with the evidence. It requires only a confident assertion that the premise is impossible. The premise that Bronze Age ships could cross the North Atlantic has been demonstrated by experiment. It is not impossible. It may not have happened, but it could have happened, and the missing copper, the billion-plus pounds of metal mined from the Great Lakes and not found in the North American archaeological record, is a genuine mystery. The copper went somewhere. If it did not remain in North America, where did it go? Thomsen's answer is that it went to Europe. The mainstream answer is that it remained in North America, and we simply have not found it. Neither answer has been proven. Neither has been refuted. The mystery remains, large and heavy as copper, sitting in the record. I find the Great Lakes copper mystery one of the most compelling aspects of this entire discussion because it is so concrete. 1 billion pounds is a lot of copper. That is not a small anomaly. That is a large, documented, quantified discrepancy between what was mined and what has been found in the archaeological record. Either the copper is in North America somewhere, awaiting discovery in archaeological contexts that have not yet been found or recognized, or it is somewhere else. Where else could it be? The obvious answer is Europe, where Bronze Age peoples were desperately in need of copper, and where the archaeological record of the Bronze Age shows large quantities of copper whose ultimate origin has not been definitively identified. Bronze Age European copper has been analyzed using isotopic methods that can, in principle, identify the geological source of the copper by its isotopic signature. The results of these analyses have been mixed and disputed. Some analyses have suggested that significant quantities of European Bronze Age copper came from sources that do not match any known European deposit. Others have argued that the matching to New World deposits is not conclusive. This is exactly the kind of scientific question that should be the subject of major funded research programs, bringing together the best available isotopic analysis techniques and the largest possible comparative database of copper sources from both the New World and the Old. That research has not been conducted at the scale required to provide definitive answers. Why not? Because conducting it at the required scale would require taking seriously the possibility that the answers might point towards New World sources, which would require taking seriously the possibility of transatlantic contact in the Bronze Age, which requires revising the existing model. The model protects itself, but the copper is real. The discrepancy is real. The question is real, and it will not disappear. Let me now describe a very specific kind of artifact that has been found at a small number of sites in North America, and that is, if genuine, one of the most extraordinary pieces of evidence in this entire discussion. These artifacts are carved stone tablets, small enough to hold in the hand, bearing inscriptions in ancient scripts that have their closest analogs in the Old World. I mentioned the Bat Creek stone earlier, and the Grave Creek stone. There are several others. One of the most interesting is an object known as the Los Lunas Decalogue stone, a large boulder in New Mexico bearing an inscription in Paleo-Hebrew that appears to be a version of the Ten Commandments. The stone is in a location that was not easily accessible to a forger in the 19th century when it was first documented by a European American. It has been analyzed by linguists who specialize in ancient Hebrew, and the consensus among those specialists is that the inscription is genuine Paleo-Hebrew, and that it includes certain archaic linguistic features that a modern forger would need to be extraordinarily knowledgeable to reproduce. The stone has been dated indirectly by the degree of weathering of the inscription compared to the natural weathering of the surrounding boulder surface. The inscription appears old, with weathering consistent with an age of at least several centuries, possibly much more. The mainstream archaeological response is that the stone is a forgery or a misidentification. Though the specific mechanism of forgery has never been satisfactorily explained, the stone's location in a remote area of New Mexico raises questions about how a forger would have placed it there and why. I am not in a position to tell you that the Los Lunas Decalogue stone is genuine. I am in a position to tell you that the arguments for its genuineness are more substantial than the mainstream dismissal suggests, and that it deserves the kind of systematic, published, peer-reviewed analysis it has not received. There is a pattern here, as there is throughout this story. Objects that the model asserts cannot be genuine receive a level of scrutiny insufficient to resolve the question in either direction, and are then dismissed based on the insufficiency of the evidence rather than on positive evidence of forgery. The insufficient evidence is often the result of insufficient investigation, which is often the result of the prior decision that the object cannot be genuine. The circular logic is frustrating, but it is also, in a strange way, revealing. The maintenance of the circle requires effort. It requires people to decide before looking what they will see. That kind of effort is not what you invest in a question you are genuinely confident you can answer. You invest that effort in a question you are afraid to leave open. The possibility that ancient Semitic people left inscriptions in the American Southwest is frightening to the institution of American archaeology in ways that deserve examination. What exactly is the fear? What would it mean for the field, for the legal frameworks, for the broader cultural and political landscape? Some of those fears are legitimate. The history of claims about ancient Semitic contact with the Americas is entangled with Mormon theology, with various forms of anti-indigenous racism, with the kind of pseudo-history used to deny Native American peoples their heritage. Those entanglements are real. and the fear of contributing to them, even inadvertently, is understandable. But the solution to those entanglements is not to suppress the evidence. It is to engage with the evidence rigorously and honestly, to distinguish between what the evidence actually reveals and what ideologues want it to reveal, and to refuse to let the misuse of a question determine whether the question can be asked. The Los Lunas Decalogue stone, the Bat Creek stone, the Grave Creek stone, and the other inscribed objects in this story do not belong to any ideology. They are physical objects in the world. They either are what they appear to be, or they are not. Determining which requires investigation, not prior decision. That investigation is owed to the question. It is owed to the researchers who have raised it. And in a strange way, it is owed to the objects themselves, which have been sitting in museums on hillsides and in archives for over a century, waiting for someone to examine them honestly. Let me now tell you about the thing that first made me take this whole subject seriously. It is not a stone, an inscription, or a genetic anomaly. It is a map. In 1513, a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis compiled a map of the world using sources he described as including very old charts, some of them ancient. The map, drawn on gazelle hide, survived and was rediscovered in 1929 in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. When modern cartographers examined it, they found something astonishing. The map showed the coastlines of the Americas with a precision that should not have been possible in 1513, before European exploration had mapped more than the Caribbean and the northeastern coast of South America. More remarkably, the map appeared to show the coastline of Antarctica, a continent not officially discovered until 1820, and whose coastline beneath the ice was not fully mapped until the 1950s using seismic surveys. The Piri Reis map controversy has generated enormous argument over the past century. Some researchers have argued that the apparent showing of Antarctica is a coincidence, that the southern coastline on the map is actually a distorted representation of Patagonia or some other known region. Others have argued that the precision of the map proves it was copied from sources far more ancient than any known chart, possibly from the records of a civilization that mapped the world in a remote prehistoric period. I am not going to resolve the Piri Reis map controversy here. The arguments are complex and technical, and I do not believe they can be resolved in a narrative format. What I want to point to is what the map represents in the context of our broader discussion. Evidence that ancient geographical knowledge may have been more extensive than the official historical record suggests, and that the mechanisms by which that knowledge was transmitted across time are poorly understood. Piri Reis himself described using very old charts. Where did those charts come from? Who made them? When? The questions attached to the map are in some ways as interesting as the map itself. What the Piri Reis map, whether or not its most dramatic interpretations are correct, illustrates is that the official history of geographical knowledge is incomplete. Maps that should not have existed apparently did exist. Knowledge that should not have been available apparently was available. The story of what people knew, and when they knew it, is more complicated than the official narrative allows. And if the official narrative of geographical knowledge is more complicated than it appears, then the official narrative of human movement and contact is also likely more complicated than it appears. The stones of New England, the Piri Reis map, the missing Great Lakes copper, the Bat Creek stone, haplogroup X2A, the astronomical alignments, the inscriptions, and the oral traditions of the northeastern tribes all point in the same direction. Not to a single unified theory of pre-Columbian contact, but to a recognition that the human story of the Americas is more complex and more connected to the wider human world than the current model of American prehistory allows. That is the honest summary of what the evidence suggests. It does not mean that everything in the alternative archaeology literature is correct. Much of it is not. The field attracts speculation, wishful thinking, and outright fraud alongside genuine scholarship. And distinguishing between them requires exactly the kind of careful, critical, methodologically rigorous engagement that the mainstream has been unwilling to provide. But the genuine scholarship is there. The researchers doing careful work are there. The evidence they have assembled is there. And the questions they are asking deserve answers the mainstream has not provided. That is where we are. And that, when you step back and look at it, is an extraordinary place to be. We are at the edge of one of the most significant potential revisions in the history of American archaeology. The revision may come soon, or it may take another generation, but the evidence is pointing in a direction, and the direction is clear, and eventually, the institution will have to follow. The stones of New England will be part of what forces the issue. They are too well built, too precisely aligned, too consistently constructed to be dismissed indefinitely. The ground-penetrating radar surveys will eventually lead to excavations, and the excavations will eventually yield the kind of datable materials that will force a reckoning. The ancient DNA research will eventually produce genetic data from northeastern North America comprehensive enough to test the haplogroup X2A hypothesis properly. Eventually, the convergence of evidence will be too great for silence to sustain, and the story that emerges from that convergence will be one of the great stories in the history of human archaeology. The story of a crossing that changed the world, that left monuments in stone on the hillsides of New England, that may have influenced the cultures of the Northeast in ways we have not yet recognized, that wove Old World knowledge and Old World tradition into the fabric of the American past in ways that centuries of scholarship have not been willing to see. That story is waiting to be told. The stones are waiting to tell it. The light is ready. All we have to do is show up and look. You have been with me for a long time tonight, through forests and hillsides and archives and controversies and the specific gravity of old stones on winter mornings. If you are still here, if sleep has not yet taken you, I want to say something I mean sincerely. The willingness to sit with questions that lack answers, to follow evidence into territories where the maps run out, to hold uncertainty without resolving it into either comfortable belief or comfortable dismissal. That is one of the most human and most admirable things there is. It is what science requires. It is what honest inquiry requires. And it is what these stones, in their patient, aligned, intentional presence in the New England landscape, are asking of us. They are asking us to look without deciding in advance what we will see. They are asking us to measure before we conclude. They are asking us to be as careful in our understanding as they were in their construction. That is a reasonable request. The night is ending somewhere. The sky is beginning to consider the idea of morning. And in Vermont, on a hillside, in a chamber that has been waiting patiently through more winters than any of us will live, the angle of the dawn light is approaching the precise angle it will need to enter that passage. Not today, not this morning. The solstice is weeks away, or months away, or just past, depending on when you are listening to this. But it will come. It always comes. The wheel turns, and the sun moves, and the light enters the chamber, and the back wall holds it for its 20 minutes of gold. That is the promise the builders made when they aligned the entrance. A promise not to any specific person or any specific generation, but to time itself, to the future, to whoever would be standing there when the moment came. The promise has been kept for thousands of years. The promise has been kept. That is the most remarkable thing about these stones. Not the mystery of who built them, as fascinating as that mystery is. Not the evidence for pre-Columbian contact, as significant as that evidence may be. But the simple fact that the alignment works. They build it right. They built it to endure. And it endured. And on the solstice morning, for the thousands of solstice mornings that have passed since the chamber was built, the light has entered. Faithful as geometry. Faithful as the movement of the earth around the sun. Faithful as the intention that placed those stones in that orientation on that hillside. Faithful. That word feels right for those stones. They are faithful to their purpose across an ocean of time. We should be faithful to ours, to understand, to investigate, to tell the truth about what we find. Good night. Sleep well. Dream of old stones and faithful light, and the long, patient, extraordinary story of what it means to be human on this planet, moving across it, marking it, leaving behind in the landscape evidence that we were here, and that we knew something, and that we built it to endure. It endured. It is still there. Go and find it. But first, sleep. There is something else I want to leave you with. Something less about the evidence and more about what the evidence means for the way we understand ourselves. Every mystery like this one, every question about the deep past that refuses to be tidied away into the existing categories, is ultimately a question about the range of human possibility. What were people capable of? How far did they go? What did they build and why? How much did they understand about the sky, the sea, and the stone? The story of pre-Columbian North America, as the official model tells it, is already a story of extraordinary human achievement. The cultures that built Cahokia, the Newark earthworks, and the Pueblo Bonito complex of Chaco Canyon were doing remarkable things with limited technology and in challenging environments. The agricultural traditions of the American Southwest, the trade networks of the Hopewell culture, the astronomical knowledge embedded in the great earthworks of Ohio. All of these represent achievements that should fill us with genuine admiration. But the official model also imposes a kind of ceiling on our admiration. It asserts these were isolated achievements. These people were not connected to the wider world. They developed what they developed in separation. And that separation, while not making their achievements less real, makes the story smaller than it might otherwise be. The alternative, the story the New England Chamber evidence points towards, is not a smaller story. It is a larger one. It suggests that these people, or at least some of the people who inhabited this continent before European colonization, were connected to a wider world. They were part of a human network that spanned the Atlantic. They received and transmitted knowledge, material objects, and possibly people across an ocean that the official story asserts was uncrossable. That is a bigger story, a more connected story, a more fully human story. Because human beings are, by nature, connected, mobile, curious, and willing to cross the water to see what is on the other side. The Americas were always part of the human world. The official story has attempted to make them an exception, a separate development, a pristine isolation that was only broken when Columbus arrived. That story, whatever its other merits, diminishes the Americas. It makes them less than part of the human story rather than central to it. The stones of New England, if they mean what the evidence suggests they mean, are not evidence of European superiority or indigenous inferiority. They are evidence of human connectivity. They are evidence that the Atlantic was not the barrier the official story needs it to be. That people were crossing it in both directions, or at least in one direction, long before the age of exploration. That evidence, if confirmed, will not diminish the indigenous peoples of North America. It will confirm what the indigenous peoples of North America have often asserted about themselves. That they are part of a larger human world. That their history is connected to the wider history of humanity. That the story of this continent did not begin in isolation and does not need to be told that way. The stones say we are all connected. The ocean is not a wall. The horizon is not a limit. People went there and built something, and the something is still there. That is worth knowing. That is worth investigating. That is worth, on a winter night when the questions are larger than the answers and the darkness outside is deep and the wind in the trees sounds like it might be carrying something from a long way away, lying quietly and thinking about. The human world is larger than any of our models for it. The stones know this. They have always known it. And now, finally, after this long journey through the evidence and the mysteries and the silences and the possibilities, I will let you sleep. The questions will be there in the morning. The stones will be there on their hillsides. The evidence will continue to accumulate, slowly and in the face of institutional resistance towards the truth. And somewhere in Vermont, in a forest that has grown up around stones that were ancient before the forest was young, A chamber sits on a hillside, its entrance facing the northeast, its corbelled ceiling holding up the weight of the earth above it, its interior cool and dark and smelling of old stone and time. The solstice will come. The light will enter. The back wall will hold it for its brief and faithful time. The builders knew that would happen when they built it. They built it for exactly that moment. And the moment keeps returning, year after year after year. Faithful to the geometry that anonymous hands embedded in stone on a Vermont hillside an unknowable number of winters ago. That faithfulness is one of the most beautiful things I know about. Sleep now. Let the questions rest. Let the stones hold what they hold. And tomorrow, if you feel moved, go outside and look at the landscape around you. And remember that the human story is longer, stranger, and more connected than any of our official accounts of it can fully contain. That the people who came before us, all of them, everywhere, were capable of extraordinary things. That they crossed oceans we said they could not cross, and built monuments we cannot fully explain, and left behind them in the landscape a record of their presence that is still speaking in the patient language of stone and alignment and the angle of the winter sun. It is speaking to you. Good night. There is one more thing I want to sit with before this night closes entirely. Throughout everything we have discussed, from the stone chambers and their astronomical alignments to the genetic anomalies and the inscriptions and the colonial records and the missing copper and the underwater archaeology and the botanical evidence and the linguistic comparisons, there is a thread that runs through all of it that I have not quite named directly. The thread is this. The people who built those chambers understood something about the relationship between the built environment and the natural world that we have largely lost. They understood that a building can be in conversation with its landscape, that a structure can be oriented not just for practical shelter, but for meaning, for ceremony, for the marking of moments that matter. That understanding is not uniquely theirs. It is found in cultures all over the world. In the great temple complexes of Southeast Asia that align to the solstice and the equinox. In the pre-Columbian monuments of Mexico and Central America that track the movements of Venus. In the earth lodges of the Plains peoples that orient their entrances to the sunrise. In the kivas of the Pueblo peoples that align their sipapu, the symbolic hole to the underworld, with cosmic directions. The impulse to make a building that is in conversation with the sky is a deeply human impulse. It arises wherever people have the time, the knowledge, and the care to act on it. What the New England Chambers suggest is that people with the time, the knowledge, and the care were in New England earlier than the official story allows, and that they acted on that impulse in the specific technical form of the Atlantic megalithic tradition. Corbelled stone chambers aligned to the seasonal turning points. That specific technical form is traceable. It has a history. It has a homeland on the Atlantic coast of Europe. And its presence in New England is a question that demands an answer. The answer is not yet available. But the question is alive, and alive questions are the engine of understanding. Without them, we stop learning. With them, we are always on the edge of knowing more than we knew yesterday. These stones have been a question in the landscape of New England for longer than anyone alive can remember. They will continue to be a question until someone gives them the honest and rigorous investigation they deserve. When that investigation comes, and it will come, the people doing it will stand in that corridor of solstice light, in the cold interior of an old stone chamber on a Vermont hill, and they will feel what every person who has stood there has felt, that they are in the presence of intention, that someone knew something here, that someone cared. And that caring, crystallized in stone and alignment and the patient waiting of millennia, will be the most human thing they have ever encountered. The night is deep, the forest is quiet, the stones are on their hillsides, aligned to the sky, faithful to their purpose. Rest now. The story will be here when you wake. Good night. And if you found something tonight in these questions, something worth holding, something that made the darkness a little more interesting and the unknown a little less frightening, then these stones have done what stones like them have always done. They have marked the moment. They have held the light. They have said, someone was here. Someone knew. Someone built this to endure. It endured. You are listening to it still. That is everything. There are places on this earth that hold time differently than others. Not metaphorically, not in the sense of atmosphere or mood, but in a literal, physical, measurable way. The stone chambers of New England are such places. They hold time in the precision of their construction, in the accuracy of their alignments, in the organic material sealed beneath their foundation stones that carbon dating has placed thousands of years in the past. They hold time the way all monuments hold time, as deliberate acts of preservation, of saying, this moment matters, and we are going to make certain that the evidence of its matching survives. The people who built them understood something we are only beginning to recover. That time is not an arrow moving in one direction only. It is a circle, a spiral, a wheel that turns. The solstice returns every year. The equinox returns. The seasons repeat. The sky turns above the same hills it has always turned above. And in that turning, that faithful repetition of the astronomical calendar that the chambers mark, there is something the builders wanted to hold on to, that they encoded in stone so that it would outlast the language they spoke, the names they carried, and the specific details of the lives they lived. What they encoded is a relationship between the built and the cosmic, between the human-made and the naturally given, between the brief life of any one person and the immense time span of the turning heavens. That relationship is still readable in the chambers, in the alignments, in the light that enters on the right morning. We are still part of it. We always were. The night holds you now. The questions have settled into the background where they belong at this hour, becoming the texture of sleep rather than the obstacle to it. The stones are on their hillsides. The light is faithful. The wheel turns. Sleep well and dream of what remains. What makes these stones so particular, so specific in their power, is that they do not ask you to believe anything. They do not require faith. They only require presence, attention, and the willingness to measure what is actually there. The measurements speak for themselves. The alignments are what they are. The construction is what it is. The age markers in the soil beneath the foundation stones are what they are. Presence, attention, measurement. These are the only tools the stones ask you to bring. And in the practice of bringing them, something occurs that is hard to name, but that everyone who has spent serious time at these sites has described in some form. You become aware that you are in conversation with a past that is not dead, not finished, not fully understood, but real. As real as the granite under your hands, as real as the angle of the light. That is where we are. That is where the story is. And the story is still being written in the journals, the field notes, the genetic databases, the ground-penetrating radar surveys, and the careful work of researchers who have not yet given up on the question. The story is still being written, and you have been part of it tonight, listening in the darkness, following the thread into the old forests and the cold chambers, and the long, unresolved question of who built what and why and when. Thank you for that. Good night. The morning will come. It always comes. And on some future morning, the morning that the investigation finally occurs, that the excavation finally takes place, that the datable materials are finally recovered, analyzed, published, and engaged with by the institution that has been silent for so long, the story that the chambers have been telling in stone and light will finally be told in words the wider world can hear. That morning is approaching. The stones are waiting for it. So are we. The cold morning arrives in the Vermont forest the same way it always has. Without announcement, without ceremony, the darkness simply beginning to loosen at its edges, gray filtering through the bare trees, the snow on the ground reflecting back what little light there is. The chamber on the hillside is the same temperature it was before dawn. Cold and still and dark inside, the stones holding their positions against the weight of the earth and the slow press of winter's past counting. And then the light shifts at the entrance. The gray brightens to something warmer. And there it is, as promised, as built, as intended, by hands that no living memory recalls. The rectangle of gold traveling down the passage and arriving, faithful as it has always been, at the back wall of the chamber. It holds for its allotted time, then it moves on, and the chamber is gray and quiet again, waiting as it has always waited for the next. Also, like and subscribe to my channel. Ancient Tales Sleep. Good night, sweet dreams.